A dramatic depiction of Sultan Qutuz in Cairo, seated on his throne, issuing the fatal order to execute the arrogant Mongol envoys, whose terrified faces reflect the unprecedented challenge to Mongol supremacy. Emphasize the tension and monumental decision that set the stage for the Battle of Ain Jalut, highlighting the richly decorated Mamluk court armor against the looming shadow of the impending invasion. Mongolian historical costume painting. General Baybars, leading his Mamluk vanguard, executing the masterful feigned retreat across the valley floor at Ain Jalut, drawing the overconfident Mongol heavy cavalry deeper into the prepared horseshoe formation. Capture the swirling dust and the desperate energy of the retreat, ensuring the detail of Mamluk composite bows and light armor is historically accurate in this crucial tactical maneuver. Mongolian historical costume painting. The powerful Mongol general Kitbukha, a Nestorian Christian, charging fiercely at the head of his 20,000 warriors, eyes fixed on the retreating enemy, completely unaware of the looming Mamluk trap hidden in the surrounding hills, illustrating the tragic overconfidence that sealed the Mongol fate on that September day in 1260, after centuries of unparalleled victories. Mongolian historical costume painting. A sweeping panorama capturing the moment the two massive cavalries collide in the Jizrel Valley. Mamluk Ghalams, disciplined and desperate, meeting the relentless fury of the Mongol horse archers, showing the chaos of swords, lances, and flying arrows under the harsh Palestinian sun, conveying the sheer brutality and high stakes of this pivotal medieval engagement. Mongolian historical costume painting. A poignant scene at sunset over Ain Jalut, the Mamluk standard proudly planted on the hill crest, surrounded by exhausted, bloodied survivors, while below, the valley is strewn with the bodies of fallen Mongol warriors and horses. Marking the definitive moment, the myth of Mongol invincibility was irrevocably broken forever, and a civilization was saved. Hulagu Han, far away in Persia, receiving the shocking news of Kitbukha's defeat and the massive loss of prestige at Goliath Spring, depict his profound rage and disbelief, surrounded by concerned advisors in his opulent war tent, the background showing the vast, interconnected supply lines now severed by this unexpected defeat at the hands of the Mamluks. A chilling depiction of the Mamluk execution of the Mongol ambassadors outside the gates of Cairo, their severed heads placed high on poles as a grim, defiant message to the approaching army, emphasizing the Mamluk commitment to fight rather than surrender, contrasted against the massive, imposing, and detailed fortifications of the medieval city walls. An intensely detailed study comparing the sophisticated, overlapping lamellar armor and curved scimitars of the elite Mamluk warrior with the layered leather armor and powerful composite bows of the nomadic Mongol cavalryman, focusing on the differences in military technology and tactical attire used during the decisive, history-altering Battle of 1160. Mongolian historical costume painting. The climactic moment when Sultan Qutuz, hidden in the surrounding thicket, dramatically discards his helmet, shouting "Islam," and leading the main Mamluk host in a thunderous charge down the slope, catching the pursuing Mongol forces completely by surprise in the sudden, decisive ambush maneuver that turned the tide of world history. Mongolian historical costume painting. A highly symbolic map-like rendering depicting the westernmost expansion of the Mongol Empire, suddenly arrested at the Euphrates River following Ain Jalut, illustrating the Mamluk Sultanate as the impenetrable shield of the Islamic world, using rich color fields to signify control, conflict zones, and the establishment of a permanent border. Mongolian historical costume painting.
The subsequent treacherous assassination of Sultan Qutuz by Baybars and his conspirators during a hunting expedition 2 months after the heroic victory, capturing the dramatic betrayal in a secluded, autumnal landscape, juxtaposing the glorious military triumph with the dark reality of political ambition and Mamluk power transition in the Egyptian realm. Mongolian historical costume painting. A highly symbolic depiction of the collision between the overwhelming, seemingly unstoppable force of the Mongol world empire, represented by a fierce, predatory cavalry column, and the desperate, resolute determination of the Mamluk army in the narrow confines of the Ain Jalut Valley, deciding the fate of the Near East and the trajectory of global civilization. Mongolian historical costume painting. Visualize the critical moment at Ain Jalut, where Sultan Qutuz, having thrown off his helmet, charges down from the hidden hills, leading the Mamluk main force into the unsuspecting, pursuing Mongol cavalry, capturing the chaos and shock of the perfect horseshoe trap closing in the valley. A defining turning point in 13th century warfare, highly detailed cinematic composition, dramatic lighting. Mongolian historical costume painting. A dramatic illustration of Baybars executing the feigned Mamluk retreat across the Jezreel Valley floor, tempting the overly confident Mongol forces commanded by Kitbuka to break formation and chase, showing the initial dust and confusion of the tactical withdrawal before the ambush springs, capturing the desperate stakes of the September 1160 battle, rendered with vibrant colors and rich textures. Mongolian historical costume painting.
A poignant yet fierce depiction of the death of General Kitbuka, the Nestorian Christian Mongol commander, surrounded by relentless Mamluk soldiers in the climax of the battle, highlighting his final defiant stand against overwhelming odds within the valley trap, emphasizing his detailed armor and the intensity of the close-quarters combat against the Egyptian cavalry. A pivotal moment in the cessation of westward Mongol expansion. Mongolian historical costume painting. An epic confrontation scene depicting the immense collision of 50,000 Mongol riders, renowned masters of composite bows and swift tactics, against the 20,000 heavily armored Mamluk slave warriors determined to save civilization, emphasizing the clash of civilizations in the fateful Ain Jalut Valley in 1260, showcasing the ferocity and desperation of the underdogs, achieving the impossible feat of stopping the previously unbeatable horde. Mongolian historical costume painting. A majestic panorama overlooking the battlefield at sunset on September 3, 1260, showing the immediate aftermath of the Mamluk victory, symbolizing the shattering of the myth of Mongol invincibility, with scattered Mongol banners and exhausted Mamluk soldiers standing victorious over the fallen, signifying the moment the Mongol world empire expansion was permanently halted, capturing the silent awe and immense historical weight of the accomplishment. Mongolian historical costume painting. Illustrate the chilling, ruthless efficiency of the Mongol war machine just prior to the battle, showing thousands of fierce, disciplined cavalrymen clad in leather and light armor, ready to spread the terror witnessed in Baghdad and Damascus, highlighting the speed, coordination, and the devastating power of their cavalry tactics that made them seem unstoppable until this fateful encounter at Goliath's Spring. Mongolian historical costume painting. A powerful portrait of the Mamluk army gathering for the push north from Cairo, emphasizing their fierce resolve, discipline, and understanding that failure meant the total destruction of the remaining Islamic world, focusing on the elite training of these former slave soldiers and their distinctive armor and weaponry, embodying the last line of defense against the devastating hordes under the leadership of Sultan Qutuz. Mongolian historical costume painting. Depict the intense volume of arrows darkening the sky during the initial phase of the Battle of Ain Jalut, where the Mongol composite bows unleashed their lethal long-range barrage against the Mamluk vanguard, emphasizing the dust kicked up by thousands of galloping horses and the desperate exchange of missile fire before the close combat engagement, showing the tactical necessity of enduring the missile storm,
highly chaotic and detailed battle study, Mongolian historical costume painting.
A visual representation of Hulagu Khan receiving news of the great Khan Munka's death, leading to his necessary and rapid withdrawal of the main Mongol force from Syria, juxtaposed with the small, confident contingent left behind under Kitbucha, emphasizing the critical strategic context that gave Kutus the narrow window of opportunity to strike and change world history by confronting the fragmented Mongol command. Mongolian historical costume painting. An evocative scene set in the quiet, rolling landscape of Ain Jalut, Goliath Spring in northern Palestine, showing the valley transformed into a swirling, bloody vortex of medieval warfare, where the giant, seemingly unbeatable power of the Mongols was finally slain by the determined Mamluk forces, highlighting the historical echo of the location's name and the unexpected victory achieved through superior strategy and courage. Rendered with strong composition and dramatic lighting, Mongolian historical costume painting. Illustrate Sultan Kutu's decisive and morale-boosting personal charge, shouting "Islam" as the hidden Mamluk reserves poured out of the concealment, directly impacting the stalled and surprised Mongol flanks, showcasing the immediate shift in momentum and the bravery required to confront the previously unbeatable enemy in hand-to-hand combat, emphasizing the rich banners and standards of both armies during the crucial ambush phase. Mongolian historical costume painting. A conceptual visualization illustrating the geopolitical earthquake caused by the victory at Ain Jalut, showing Cairo rising as the new center of learning and power, replacing destroyed Baghdad, while the western border of the vast Mongol Empire suddenly solidifies at the Euphrates, representing the crucial preservation of Islamic culture and the diversion of history that potentially saved Europe. A highly symbolic and profound historical moment captured in art, Mongolian historical costume painting. Depict the moment Kutus throws off his helmet and leads the Mamluk main force bursting from the concealing hillsides into the valley of Ain Jalut, catching the pursuing Mongol cavalry in a perfect, desperate horseshoe trap, emphasized the shock and chaotic realization of the Mongol general Kitbucha as fresh, determined Mamluk banners surround his forces under the searing September sun, rendered in the dramatic, detailed style of a Mongolian historical costume painting. Illustrate the terrifying power and speed of the Mongol heavy cavalry charge at the peak of their empire's expansion, thousands of riders thundering down towards the initial Mamluk skirmish line, arrows darkening the air, capturing the absolute confidence and perceived invincibility of Kitbucha's army just moments before they realize the feigned retreat is a devastating trap, highly detailed and vibrant, presented as a majestic Mongolian historical costume painting. A powerful, stern portrayal of Mamluk Sultan Kutuz standing defiantly in Cairo, commanding the execution of the arrogant Mongol envoys whose heads are soon to be displayed on poles, symbolizing the refusal to surrender and the commitment to a fight deemed hopeless. Focusing on the intricate armor of Kutuz contrasting with the fear on the faces of the captured Mongol emissaries, executed in the intricate style of a Mongolian historical costume painting. Capture the strategic brilliance of Baibars leading the Mamluk vanguard in the crucial feigned retreat, their disciplined withdrawal pulling the overconfident Mongol pursuit deeper into the valley choke point, showcasing the exhaustion and controlled chaos of the initial clash before the main ambush is sprung, focusing on the tension of the maneuver under the watchful eyes of hidden Mamluk reserves, executed in the grand narrative style of a Mongolian historical costume painting. Visualize the profound historical consequence, the Euphrates River border established after Ain Jalut, showing exhausted but resolute Mamluk sentinels guarding the limit of the shattered Mongol westward expansion, contrasting the fertile lands of Syria and Egypt with the desolate eastern reaches now stabilized, symbolizing the saving of the Islamic heartland,
depicted with reverence in the epic, meticulous style of a Mongolian historical costume painting. A dramatic portrait of General Kitbuka, the Nestorian Christian Mongol commander, fighting desperately amid the chaos of the Mamluk encirclement, realizing the tactical genius of the trap as his forces disintegrate around him, emphasizing his intricate armor, weathered face, and the desperate, doomed effort to rally his troops against the overwhelming surprise, executed in the intense, detailed style of a Mongolian historical costume painting. Juxtapose the image of the Tigris River running black with ink from the destroyed libraries of Baghdad in 1258 with the victorious Mamluk banner raised over the battlefield of Ain Jalut in 1260, symbolizing the abrupt halt to the cultural annihilation, highlighting the preservation of knowledge and civilization that the Mamluk victory secured, rendered in a powerful dual-scene composition, utilizing the vibrant palette of a Mongolian historical costume painting. A panoramic view of the Jezreel Valley, the site of Ain Jalut or Goliath Spring, on the morning of September 3, 1260, focusing on the topographical features, the open ground and surrounding concealing hills that Kutuz expertly utilized to hide his main army, showing the dust rising from the initial cavalry clash in the distance, capturing the calm before the decisive storm, interpreted through the lens of a meticulous Mongolian historical costume painting. A panoramic view of the Jezreel Valley, the site of Ain Jalut or Goliath Spring, on the morning of September 3, 1260, focusing on the topographical features, the open ground and surrounding concealing hills that Kutuz expertly utilized to hide his main army, showing the dust rising from the initial cavalry clash in the distance, capturing the calm before the decisive storm, interpreted through the lens of a meticulous Mongolian historical costume painting. A panoramic view of the Jezreel Valley, the site of Ain Jalut or Goliath Spring, on the morning of September 3, 1260, focusing on the topographical features, the open ground and surrounding concealing hills that Kutuz expertly utilized to hide his main army, showing the dust rising from the initial cavalry clash in the distance, capturing the calm before the decisive storm, interpreted through the lens of a meticulous Mongolian historical costume painting. A panoramic view of the Jezreel Valley, the site of Ain Jalut or Goliath Spring, on the morning of September 3, 1260, focusing on the topographical features, the open ground and surrounding concealing hills that Kutuz expertly utilized to hide his main army, showing the dust rising from the initial cavalry clash in the distance, capturing the calm before the decisive storm, interpreted through the lens of a meticulous Mongolian historical costume painting.
Detailed depiction como impak, detail shabaten payin, Mongol composite bowmen unleashing a devastating volley of arrows, illustrating the technological superiority and disciplined coordination that made them seemingly unbeatable, contrasting their deadly efficiency with the determined, armored Mamluk opponents bracing for impact in the foreground, highly focused on the intricate details of their equipment and posture, depicted in the precise realism of a Mongolian historical costume painting. Show the Mamluk heavy cavalry, disciplined former slaves, now elite warriors, executing the decisive countercharge from the hidden positions, their formation tight and their resolve visible as they smash into the stretched and confused Mongol pursuit line, emphasizing the coordinated timing and the sheer physical impact of the unexpected engagement, rendered in the heroic, dynamic motion typical of a Mongolian historical costume painting. Captured the demoralization and chaotic flight of the surviving Mongol forces at sunset following the death of Kitbuka, pursued relentlessly by the victorious Mamluks, illustrating the visual representation of the shattered myth of Mongol invincibility, focusing on the exhaustion, fear, and scattering of the once unbeatable horde, detailed meticulously in the narrative style characteristic of a Mongolian historical costume painting.
depict the climactic moment at Ain Jalut, where Sultan Qutuz, having cast aside his helmet, stands high on a ridge overlooking the valley, signaling the Mamluk main force hidden in the hills to spring the trap on the pursuing Mongol heavy cavalry. Emphasize the dust, the sudden shift from retreat to counterattack, capturing the desperate resolve of the Mamluks and the initial shock of the Mongol commander Kitbuka's vanguard, rendered with dramatic light and shadow contrast, Mongolian historical costume painting. Visualize the dramatic scene in Cairo, where the Mamluk Sultan Qutuz confronts the arrogant Mongol envoys sent by Hulagu Khan, delivering the ultimatum for surrender, just moments before their execution. Capture the tension in the royal court, contrasting the ornate Mamluk attire with the rough, threatening presence of the Mongolian emissaries, highlighting the historical defiance that initiated the war. Focusing on the high stakes of the political confrontation, Mongolian historical costume painting. Depict the climactic moment at Ain Jalut, where Sultan Qutuz, having cast aside his helmet, stands high on a ridge overlooking the valley, signaling the Mamluk main force hidden in the hills to spring the trap on the pursuing Mongol heavy cavalry. Emphasize the dust, the sudden shift from retreat to counterattack, capturing the desperate resolve of the Mamluks and the initial shock of the Mongol commander Kitbuka's vanguard, rendered with dramatic light and shadow contrast, Mongolian historical costume painting. Visualize the dramatic scene in Cairo, where the Mamluk Sultan Qutuz confronts the arrogant Mongol envoys sent by Hulagu Khan, delivering the ultimatum for surrender, just moments before their execution. Capture the tension in the royal court, contrasting the ornate Mamluk attire with the rough, threatening presence of the Mongolian emissaries, highlighting the historical defiance that initiated the war. Focusing on the high stakes of the political confrontation, Mongolian historical costume painting.
Illustrate the strategic feigned retreat led by the brilliant Mamluk general Baybars through the desolate valley of En Jalut, drawing the seemingly invincible Mongol cavalry deep into the prearranged killing zone. Show the disciplined Mamluk horsemen turning their backs while Mongol archers aggressively press the chase, unaware of the imminent encirclement from the hidden flanks, meticulously detailed in the characteristic style of a historical scroll, Mongolian historical costume painting. A powerful depiction of the initial clash of cavalry at En Jalut, featuring the legendary disciplined Mamluk Hulams meeting the relentless charge of the Mongol horse archers and lancers. Capture the chaos, speed, and violence of the confrontation, symbolizing the moment the Mongol westward expansion was physically halted by the determined Mamluk resistance, rendered with intense movement and historical accuracy against the backdrop of the Palestinian hills. Mongolian historical costume painting. Portray the tragic final moments of the Nestorian Mongol general Kitbuka, surrounded by relentless Mamluk warriors after his army has broken, fighting valiantly but hopelessly in the muddy confines of the valley floor. The painting should focus on his armor and desperate defiance against the overwhelming Mamluk surge, emphasizing the historical weight of the Mongol loss of their elite commander and the fracturing of their morale. Mongolian historical costume painting. Create a scene depicting Hulagu Khan in his temporary Persian encampment receiving the devastating news of the complete destruction of Kitbuka's army at En Jalut. Show the great Khan's palpable rage and disbelief, contrasted with the terrified silence of his accompanying officers, symbolizing the psychological blow dealt to the previously undefeated Mongol Empire. Executed in vivid, emotionally charged colors that reflect the gravity of the defeat, Mongolian historical costume painting. A sweeping vista of the Jezreel Valley and Jalut immediately following the cessation of hostilities on the evening of September 3, 1260. The setting sun casts long shadows over the littered battlefield, showing the defeated Mongol corpses and scattered banners, while victorious Mamluk soldiers gather their wounded.
a silent tableau of a world-altering triumph over the ultimate odds in a historic landscape. Mongolian historical costume painting. Conceptual art illustrating the historical significance of the battle. On one side, the smoldering ruins of Baghdad and the ink-stained Tigris River representing Mongol destruction. On the other, the vibrant, fortified walls of Cairo representing the Mamluk defiance and the preservation of Islamic civilization achieved through military genius at En-Jalut, emphasizing the stark contrast between ruin and salvation. Mongolian historical costume painting.
Detailed illustration Kupchak of a Mamluk Gipchak cavalry, heavily armored and riding powerful horses, prepared for the decisive charge against the Mongols. Highlight their distinctive weaponry, strict formation, and shared expression of grim determination, emphasizing that these former slave soldiers were the most formidable fighting force of their time, ready to fight for their adopted faith and homeland against the invading horde. Mongolian historical costume painting. A dramatic close-up on Sultan Kutuz during the height of the engagement, shouting encouragement to his wavering troops as they struggle against the initial Mongol assault. Showing the moment he throws off his symbolic red battle helmet and declares Islam to rally his men back into the fray. A critical point of inspirational leadership that secured the victory and saved the Near East. Captured in fine detail, Mongolian historical costume painting. Visualize the sheer astonishment and demoralization among the surviving Mongol soldiers as they are routed from the valley, fleeing from an enemy they believed incapable of defeating them. Capture the psychological collapse of the formerly unbeatable horde, emphasizing the shattered discipline and fear, contrasting starkly with their earlier confidence and the rigid structure of their empire as they realize the myth is broken. Mongolian historical costume painting. A stylized, almost cartographic illustration showing the geographical layout of the Ain-Jalut Valley and the precise tactical deployment. The Mamluk hidden flanks forming the horseshoe ambush, the path of Baybar's feigned retreat, and the point where the Mongol pursuit was decisively encircled, detailing the brilliant use of terrain that led to the Mongol destruction. Rendered as a complex strategic masterpiece, Mongolian historical costume painting. A dramatic, detailed Mongolian historical costume painting capturing Sultan Kutuz of the Mamluks, resolute in his ornate armor, giving the command to execute the arrogant Mongol envoys in Cairo, their heads destined for the city gates, symbolizing the fierce refusal to surrender and the commitment to a desperate, yet necessary, defense against the seemingly unstoppable western expansion of the Great Khanate, rendered with intense color and texture. A panoramic Mongolian historical costume painting illustrating the crucial moment of the feigned retreat at Ain-Jalut, showing Baybars leading his Mamluk vanguard in a tactical withdrawal across the dusty Jezreel Valley, their forms blurring under the hot September sun as the overconfident Mongol heavy cavalry, characterized by their unique layered armor and speed, pursue them recklessly deeper into the deadly horseshoe trap set among the Palestinian hills, emphasizing movement and strategic deception. A breathtaking Mongolian historical costume painting depicting the Mamluk main force erupting from the hidden terrain surrounding Ain-Jalut, their sudden appearance from the flanks shocking the pursuing Mongol hordes, illustrating the perfect ambush tactic that shattered the myth of Mongol invincibility, focusing on the dynamic rush of fresh, disciplined cavalry surging forward to encircle the entrapped forces under the blazing sun of the pivotal battle of 1260 AD. A sorrowful and historically resonant Mongolian historical costume painting focusing on General Kitbuka, the Nestorian Mongol commander, making his desperate final stand amidst the collapsing ranks of his surrounded army in the valley of Ain-Jalut, his face grim and defiant against the overwhelming Mamluk surge, highlighting the tragic moment where the first major defeat was handed to the previously undefeated Mongol war machine, meticulously detailing his battle-worn attire. A symbolic Mongolian historical costume painting depicting the clash at Ain-Jalut where the two tides of history meet,
One side, represented by the burning ruins of Baghdad, faintly visible in the background, contrasting sharply with the Mamluk defense line, signifying the salvation of the remaining Islamic civilization and the stopping of the terror that had swept from China to Syria, capturing the monumental scale of the historical stakes in 1260 AD. A comparative Mongolian historical costume painting showcasing the intricate differences between the swift, lightly armored Mongol horse archers with their powerful composite bows and the heavily armored, discipline-forged Mamluk elite cavalry wielding scimitars and lances, locked in fierce close-quarters combat within the narrow confines of the Ain Jalut Valley, highlighting the contrast between the nomadic warfare and the refined slave soldier military system. A narrative Mongolian historical costume painting showing Hulegu Khan, preoccupied with the succession crisis following Möngke's death in distant Persia or Karakorum, receiving the catastrophic news delivered by a lone, exhausted rider detailing the total annihilation of his forces under Kidbuka at Ain Jalut, capturing the Khan's intense fury and frustration that sealed the permanent western border of the Mongol Empire along the Euphrates River. A somber Mongolian historical costume painting depicting the aftermath of the Battle of Ain Jalut at sunset, the dusty valley floor strewn with the dead and broken banners of the defeated Mongol army, with weary Mamluk soldiers standing victorious but blood-soaked, gazing at the profound evidence that the previously unstoppable global power had finally been checked, illustrating the quiet majesty of a world-altering triumph.
An intensely dramatic Mongolian historical costume painting capturing the exact second Sultan Kutuz, tearing off his helmet for maximum visibility, charges forward screaming the rallying cry, "Islam!", galvanizing the Mamluk reserves to launch their devastating surprise attack from the hills, shattering the Mongol pursuit formation and turning a potential rout into the greatest defensive victory of the 13th century at Ain Jalut. A highly detailed Mongolian historical costume painting focusing on the fierce weapon interaction during the melee phase of Ain Jalut, showcasing Mamluk archers countering the speed of Mongol arrows and the devastating efficacy of the curved Mamluk scimitars against Mongol light armor, emphasizing the close-range brutality and the sophisticated military technology that defined this clash between the two premier cavalries of the medieval world. A visionary Mongolian historical costume painting symbolizing the successful defense of Cairo and the preservation of Islamic learning, depicting the Mamluk victory column returning from Ain Jalut, carrying captured Mongol standards, while in the background, scholars safely study in Cairo's libraries, contrasting the destructive path of the Mongol conquests with the Mamluk secured cultural continuation that later influenced the European Renaissance. A poignant Mongolian historical costume painting illustrating the dark coda to the victory, the assassination of the victorious Sultan Kutuz by his ambitious general Baybars during a hunting expedition just 2 months after Ain Jalut, showing the shift from external conflict to internal power struggle, rendered with an emphasis on betrayal and the cold political reality that followed the monumental military success. A dramatic depiction of Sultan Kutuz, helmet removed, roaring Islam while leading the hidden Mamluk main force bursting forth from the concealing hills during the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, utilizing the deceptive ambush strategy against the pursuing Mongol heavy cavalry, emphasizing the desperate resolve of the Mamluk forces who refused to surrender to the previously undefeated empire, all rendered in the style of a powerful Mongolian historical costume painting. A sweeping panoramic scene illustrating the critical moment of the feigned Mamluk retreat led by Baybars, showing the initial chaotic panic of the Mamluk vanguard, drawing the overconfident Mongol pursuit deep into the narrow valley of Ain Jalut, subtly hinting at the concealed Mamluk forces waiting in the flanking hills, capturing the tactical brilliance that secured the turning point of the war against the Mongol advance, rendered in the style of a large-scale Mongolian historical costume painting.
a sweeping panoramic scene illustrating the critical moment of the feigned Mamluk retreat led by Baibars, showing the initial chaotic panic of the Mamluk vanguard, drawing the overconfident Mongol pursuit deep into the narrow valley of Ain Jalut, subtly hinting at the concealed Mamluk forces waiting in the flanking hills, capturing the tactical brilliance that secured the turning point of the war against the Mongol advance, rendered in the style of a large-scale Mongolian historical painting.
Portrait of the formidable Mongol general Kitbu-Kha, a Nestorian Christian, realizing he has been completely encircled by the Mamluk ambush, fighting valiantly amidst the dust and chaos of the Ain Jalut Valley, his horse rearing against a tide of Mamluk warriors, symbolizing the moment the seemingly unstoppable Mongolian war machine finally met its end. Detailed historical accuracy in armor, created in the style of a somber Mongolian historical costume painting. An intense metaphorical representation of the terror preceding Ain Jalut, showing the shadow of Hulagu Khan's hordes overwhelming the ancient city of Baghdad in 1258, with illuminated texts being cast into the river Tigris, contrasted with the determined faces of the Mamluk leaders receiving the surrender ultimatum in Cairo, a scene representing the clash between absolute destruction and unwavering resistance, executed in the powerful tradition of a dark Mongolian historical costume painting. A dynamic, high-action canvas depicting the violent collision of the swift Mamluk Kipchak cavalry and the highly coordinated, arrow-showering Mongol riders within the confined space of the Ain Jalut Valley floor, highlighting the superior training and determination of the Mamluk slave soldiers against the famed composite bows and speed of the Mongol warriors, illustrating the intensity of the struggle that determined the fate of the Middle East, realized in the stark vibrancy of a Mongolian historical costume painting. A contemplative scene set at sunset over the valley of Ain Jalut on September 3, 1260, showcasing exhausted Mamluk soldiers surveying the defeated Mongol dead scattered across the battlefield, emphasizing the profound geopolitical relief felt across the Islamic world as the myth of Mongol invincibility was irrevocably broken, symbolizing a pivotal shift in global power dynamics, imbued with the deep historical reverence characteristic of a detailed Mongolian historical costume painting. An illustration capturing the sheer scale and efficiency of the Mongol contingent under Kitbu-Kha before the ambush, showing 20,000 warriors armed with powerful composite bows crossing the plains of northern Palestine, their confidence palpable due to their unmatched historical record of continuous victories from China to the Mediterranean, a moment of supreme arrogance just before their historic downfall, meticulously detailed and rendered in the robust aesthetic of a Mongolian historical costume painting. Detailed close-up focusing on an elite Mamluk warrior preparing for the imminent battle, adjusting his complex lamellar armor and polishing his scimitar, showcasing the fusion of Turkish and Arab military technologies, symbolizing the Mamluk status as the ruling elite military class of Egypt, juxtaposed against the distant shadow of the advancing Mongol threat, capturing the quiet resolve before the decisive engagement at Ain Jalut, rendered with textural richness in the style of a meticulous Mongolian historical costume painting. An allegorical scene showing the geographical implications of the battle, one side depicting the endless westward expansion of the Mongol map, the largest land empire ever, abruptly stopped by a massive, solid barrier representing the Mamluk army at the future Euphrates line, visually defining Ain Jalut as the final western boundary of the Mongol conquest, a historical map projection interpreted through the visual language and tradition of a grand Mongolian historical costume painting. A chilling depiction of Sultan Qutuz in Cairo, displaying absolute defiance by ordering the execution of the Mongol envoys who delivered Hulagu Khan's arrogant surrender ultimatum, showing the severed heads displayed on poles outside the city gates, a symbolic act signaling irreversible commitment to war,
highlighting the high stakes and the Mamluk refusal to be intimidated by the overwhelming Mongol power, executed in the dramatic lighting style of a powerful Mongolian historical costume painting. A multi-panel narrative focusing on Baybars, the brilliant Mamluk general, first orchestrating the tactical feigned retreat, then later subtly hinting at the ambition that would lead him to assassinate Kutuz just months after the victory, illustrating the duality of heroism and treachery inherent in the Mamluk power structure, connecting the victory at Ain Jalut with the subsequent political turmoil, captured within the detailed narrative constraints of a striking Mongolian historical costume painting. A detailed cross-section view of the Ain Jalut Valley, illustrating the perfect concealment of the Mamluk main force under Kutuz within the surrounding ravines and groves, showing the oblivious Mongol forces streaming into the carefully prepared horseshoe formation, emphasizing the Mamluk mastery of terrain and deception that ultimately trapped the confident Mongol general Kitbuka, vividly executed to showcase the tactical deployment in the sharp visual style of a detailed Mongolian historical costume painting.
A wide, dramatic vista, capturing the Mamluk Sultan Kutuz, helmet cast aside, signaling the main charge from the concealed hillsides of Ain Jalut. The scene emphasizes the tension just before the ambush springs, showing the disciplined ranks of Mamluk cavalry blending into the arid landscape, while unsuspecting Mongol horsemen pursue the retreating Mamluk vanguard in the valley below, illuminated by the harsh midday sun, executed with meticulous detail characteristic of a Mongolian historical costume painting. A fiercely dynamic tableau depicting the moment Mamluk forces erupt from the surrounding ravines, surrounding the overextended Mongol pursuit force. The central action shows the shock on the face of the Mongol general Kitbuka as his formation collapses under the surprise onslaught, rendered in vibrant tempera, highlighting the intricate armor, flowing banners, and devastating impact of the cavalry charge, capturing the chaos and energy unique to a Mongolian historical costume painting. Illustrate the strategic feigned retreat led by General Baybars, showing the disciplined speed of the Mamluk light cavalry drawing the Mongol heavy horse deeper into the trap at Ain Jalut. Focus on the contrast between the urgent, dusty flight of the Mamluks and the aggressive, confident chase of the Mongol riders, with close-up detail on their ornate leather scale armor and composite bows, all meticulously stylized as a Mongolian historical costume painting. A powerful symbolic composition showing a victorious Mamluk banner planted firmly over shattered Mongol weapons and armor in the valley of Ain Jalut, signifying the end of the Mongol westward expansion and the collapse of the myth of their invincibility. The background features the fleeing remnants of the Mongol army being chased down by disciplined Mamluk gulams, captured with the precise, high-contrast coloration and rich textural detail expected in a Mongolian historical costume painting. Depict the tragic final moments of the Nestorian Mongol general Kitbuka, fighting valiantly but hopelessly surrounded by Mamluk warriors deep within the valley, arrows bristling around him and his horse. The image should convey the desperation and inevitability of his defeat, utilizing heavy line work and rich pigments common in historical illustrations, emphasizing the distinct cultural elements of both forces in a stark Mongolian historical costume painting. An epic panoramic scene showcasing the immense scale of the Battle of Ain Jalut, where the Mamluk resolve met the Mongol terror. Emphasize the geographical setting of the Jezreel Valley as a historical nexus, showing columns of dust rising hundreds of feet, capturing the moment world history pivoted away from complete Mongol domination, rendered with the traditional flat perspective and detailed martial gear found in a Mongolian historical costume painting. Depict the tragic, final moments of the Nestorian Mongol Kitbuka, fighting valiantly but hopelessly surrounded by Mamluk warriors deep within the valley, arrows bristling around him and his horse. The image should convey the desperation and inevitability of his defeat, utilizing heavy linework and rich pigments common in historical illustrations, emphasizing the distinct cultural elements of both forces in a stark Mongolian historical costume painting. An epic panoramic scene showcasing the immense scale of the Battle of Ain Jalut, where the Mamluk resolve met the Mongol terror, emphasize the geographical setting of the Jezreel Valley as a historical nexus, showing columns of dust rising hundreds of feet, capturing the moment world history pivoted away from complete Mongol domination, rendered with the traditional flat perspective and detailed martial gear found in a Mongolian historical costume painting.
Close-up rendering of a Mamluk soldier, formerly a slave and now an elite warrior, mounted and ready for the final charge, his face hardened with the determination that saved his civilization. Highlight his intricate chainmail and polished scimitar against the backdrop of the massive cavalry engagement, emphasizing the historical weight and martial dignity characteristic of a fine Mongolian historical costume painting. Visual representation of the furious exchange of archery as Mongol composite bows loose torrents of arrows darkening the sky during the initial phase of the battle, immediately followed by the devastating counter-volley from the ambushing Mamluk archers. The composition should focus on the tension of the drawn bows and the flight of the projectiles, illustrating this deadly historical technology within a traditional Mongolian historical costume painting. A dramatic historical portrait of Sultan Kutuz throwing down his helmet and crying, "Islam!" galvanizing his troops to burst forth from concealment. The lighting should be dramatic and theatrical, focusing attention on the intensity of the leader's expression and his ornate Mamluk battle attire, contrasted sharply against the chaotic movement of the cavalry in the distance, highly detailed in the manner of a meticulous Mongolian historical costume painting. A somber, layered image depicting the victorious Mamluks standing over the field of Ain Jalut, while subtly incorporating ghostly background elements hinting at the prior devastation of Baghdad, symbolizing the desperate context that fueled the Mamluk fight for survival. The scene must be realized with the symbolic color palettes and detailed cultural depiction found in a classic Mongolian historical costume painting. Visualize the conceptual collision of the unstoppable force, Mongol cavalry, depicted as a wave of overwhelming speed and numbers, meeting the immovable object, Mamluk discipline and strategic placement in the trap. The artwork emphasizes the point of collision, where momentum is suddenly halted, utilizing exaggerated, stylized figures and intricate horse-tack documentation, strictly in the style of a powerful Mongolian historical costume painting. An illustration showing Mamluk forces pursuing the scattered remnants of the routed Mongol army through the northern Palestine landscape, confirming their decisive victory and securing the recapture of Damascus and Aleppo. The scene captures the long-distance chase and the exhaustion of both men and horses after the grueling fight, documented with accurate weapons and uniforms, maintaining the rich ethnographic aesthetic of a historical Mongolian historical costume painting. Depict the moment of Mamluk ambush at Ain Jalut, where Sultan Kutuz, having cast off his helmet, emerges from the hidden hills, leading his fresh cavalry charge, surprising the pursuing Mongol forces, who realize they have ridden directly into a catastrophic horseshoe trap, emphasizing the chaos and the desert landscape under a fierce 13th century sun. Highly detailed, dynamic composition, cinematic lighting, dramatic historical accuracy, Mongolian historical costume painting. An intensely detailed depiction of Baybar's Mamluk vanguard executing the critical feigned retreat tactic, drawing the unsuspecting Mongol heavy cavalry, commanded by Kitbuka, deep into the valley of Ain Jalut, capturing the dust, speed, and precision of the elite slave soldiers' maneuvers against the relentless Mongol horse archers.
Focusing on the tension of the deception and the elaborate armor details, Mongolian historical costume painting. The tragic and heroic final stand of the Nestorian Mongol general Kit-Buka at Ain Jalut, surrounded by determined Mongol horsemen armed with scimitars and lances, his banner torn, expressing the shock of defeat and the end of the Western Mongol advance, illustrating the contrasting armor styles of the Ilkhanate warrior and the Egyptian elite guard in the midst of a dusty maelstrom. Mongolian historical costume painting. A highly allegorical scene illustrating the moment the myth of Mongol invincibility shattered in 1260. A colossal, cracked stone pillar bearing the crest of the Golden Horde crumbling into the sands of Ain Jalut, overlooked by a triumphant Mamluk standard-bearer, emphasizing the dramatic scale of this historical shift and the detailed cultural accuracy of the warring empires. Full wide-shot, hyper-realistic texture, Mongolian historical costume painting. A somber, panoramic view showing the aftermath of the Mongol devastation, perhaps symbolized by a rider overlooking the smoking ruins of a great city, referencing Baghdad, with the warrior clad in the heavy furs and lamellar armor typical of Hulegu Khan's Western forces, emphasizing the historical weight of the campaign before their decisive stop, capturing the ruthless efficiency of the Mongol war machine. Mongolian historical costume painting. A portrait of Sultan Qutuz of the Mamluks standing defiant in Cairo after ordering the execution of the Mongol envoys, his gaze stern and resolved, holding the decree of war, contrasting the lavish but austere Mamluk court attire with the implied threat of the vast Mongol steppe empire. Rich textural detail on silk and hardened leather, dramatic low-key lighting reflecting the high stakes. Mongolian historical costume painting.
Capture the sheer intensity of the main cavalry engagement during the afternoon climax of Ain Jalut. Thousands of Mamluk Faris, horsemen, and Mongol warriors locked in brutal close-quarters combat, shafts of sunlight piercing the cloud of dust kicked up by the relentless action, emphasizing the unique weaponry, including the powerful composite bows and the curved Mamluk sabers, highly visceral and detailed. Mongolian historical costume painting. A sweeping vista of the Jezreel Valley, or Goliath Spring, Ain Jalut, depicting the vast open terrain ideally suited for cavalry warfare, where the final lines of the routed Mongol army are being pursued by the fresh Mamluk reserves into the late afternoon, illustrating the strategic importance of the landscape and the fatigue etched onto the faces of the remaining horsemen. Wide, epic shot, Mongolian historical costume painting. Illustrate a Mamluk barracks or training ground in Egypt just before the march to Ain Jalut, showing the elite, disciplined warriors preparing their gear, donning highly polished chainmail and helmets, highlighting their unique status as trained slave soldiers converted to Islam, preparing to defend their civilization against the northern invaders. Focusing on the meticulous detail of their harnesses and weapons. Mongolian historical costume painting. A scene depicting the victorious Mamluk army resting on the battlefield at sunset on September 3, 1260, surrounded by the silent testament of dead Mongol soldiers and shattered arrows, symbolizing the end of an era of terror and the beginning of Mamluk ascendancy. The colors saturated with the dust and blood of the decisive conflict, reflecting relief and exhaustion across the figures. Dramatic chiaroscuro, Mongolian historical costume painting. A dramatic illustration focusing on the signature Mongol arrow storm unleashed at the start of the battle, depicting hundreds of powerful, short-range composite bow arrows darkening the sky just before striking the Mamluk lines, with Mamluk shields raised defensively, highlighting the sheer volume and velocity of the missile barrage that defined Mongol warfare. High-speed action, ultra-detailed realism in the weaponry. Mongolian historical costume painting. A visual juxtaposition of the two great cavalries meeting in deadlock,
the lightly armored, swift Mongol horse archers of the steppe, engaging the heavily armored, lance-wielding Mamluk gulams, illustrating the profound cultural and tactical difference between the nomadic conquerors and the sophisticated Egyptian military elite, foregrounding the specific design of their helmets and horse tack during the violent confrontation. Mongolian historical costume painting.
Visualize the climactic moment of the Battle of Ain Jalut in Mutnil Huamoy Hoksao, Mutnil Shamut, showing the Mongol cavalry charging blindly into the valley, only to find Mamluk reinforcements erupting from the surrounding hills in a perfect crescent formation, depicting the shock and sudden reversal of fortune in the dusty Palestinian heat, capturing the chaos and tactical brilliance of Sultan Kutu's ambush against General Kitbuka's depleted forces, rendered in a dynamic, high-detail style reminiscent of a traditional historical epic. Mongolian historical costume painting. Depict Mamluk vanguard led by the fierce Baibars executing the feigned retreat. Show the calculated desperation on the faces of the heavily armored Mamluk horsemen as they turn to flee, drawing the overconfident Mongol pursuit deep into the trap at Ain Jalut Valley, emphasizing the contrasting desert landscape against the intricate military details of both armies' formations and weapons, showcasing the turning point of the campaign against the relentless expansion of the Mongol hordes. Mongolian historical costume painting. A dramatic portrait of the Nestorian Christian Mongol general Kitbuka during his final stand at Ain Jalut, surrounded by determined Mamluk warriors after his army has broken, emphasizing his ornate Mongol armor and grim defiance as he faces inevitable defeat, symbolizing the shattering of the myth of Mongol invincibility and the critical moment where the westward tide of the Great Khanate was finally forced to recede, using deep saturation and detailed brushwork for emotional intensity. Mongolian historical costume painting. Illustrate the brutal close-quarters combat between Mamluk ghulams and Mongol skirmishers in the narrow confines of the Ain Jalut Valley, highlighting the deadly efficiency of the Mamluk curved swords clashing against the impact of the powerful Mongol composite bows, depicting arrows filling the sky and the intense dust kicked up by thousands of horses, capturing the sheer physicality and desperation of the battle that determined the fate of the Islamic world in Motnil Huamoy Hoksao. Mongolian historical costume painting. An evocative scene showing Sultan Qutuz standing triumphantly yet bloodied over the battlefield of Ain Jalut at sunset, surveying the vanquished Mongol forces scattered across the field, the sky painted in fiery orange and red hues, reflecting the historical significance of the victory that saved Cairo from the fate of Baghdad, emphasizing the relief and exhaustion of the victorious Mamluk warriors against the backdrop of the conquered enemy banners. Mongolian historical costume painting.
Juxtapose the disciplined Mamluk lines preparing for the fight at Ain Jalut with a ghostly, stylized background depiction of the destruction of Baghdad 2 years prior, symbolized by black ink bleeding into the Tigris River, illustrating the high stakes and the Mamluk resolve to avenge the caliphate and halt Hulagu Khan's terrifying conquest, rendering the Mamluk armor and banners with precise historical detail reflective of the era's military aesthetic. Mongolian historical costume painting. Capture the dynamic movement of the two greatest cavalry forces of the 13th century colliding head-on at Ain Jalut. Focus on the difference in riding styles and equipment, the lighter, swift Mongol riders versus the heavier, disciplined Mamluk horsemen, illustrating the overwhelming speed and force of the initial charge in a sweeping vista shot of the Jizrael Valley, detailing every element of the saddle, harness, and horse gear. Mongolian historical costume painting.
A powerful, close-up depiction of Sultan Qutuz throwing off his helm and shouting the battle cry, "Islam," to signal the main Mamluk force hidden in the hills to attack the encircling Mongols, highlighting the intense emotion and personal bravery of the leader who risked everything to fight the unbeatable foe, using sharp, dramatic lighting to emphasize the moment of commitment and the raw determination in his eyes, rendered with a focus on leadership and command presence. Mongolian historical costume painting. An atmospheric illustration of Mamluk scouts first sighting the formidable yet diminished Mongol encampment near Ain Jalut, capturing the tense silence before the confrontation, emphasizing the barren, dusty landscape of northern Palestine and the subtle signs of the approaching war, detailing the contrast between the environment and the colorful, if menacing, presence of the Mongol yurts and horse herds waiting for conflict. Mongolian historical costume painting. Detailed illustration focusing on the intricate protective gear and weaponry used by the Mamluk heavy cavalry, specifically their lamellar armor and distinctive helmets, juxtaposed against the functional, layered leather and silk armor of the Mongol warriors, highlighting the technological and cultural differences visible in the battlefield equipment during the defining clash of 1260, emphasizing the craftsmanship and historical accuracy of the military costume. Mongolian historical costume painting. A narrative depiction emphasizing the Mamluks' origin as elite slave soldiers, showing their disciplined formation and unwavering commitment at Ain Jalut, fighting not for conquest but for the survival of their civilization, illustrating their fierce loyalty and training against the backdrop of the world-conquering Mongol standard, capturing the psychological intensity of the battle fought by men who were themselves once captives, fighting for their newfound freedom. Mongolian historical costume painting.
Render an aerial perspective or map-like view of the Ain Jalut Valley, clearly showing the Mamluk trap, the horseshoe formation concealed within the surrounding slopes, and the unsuspecting Mongol pursuit streaming into the center, detailing the geographical features that enabled Qutuz's decisive tactical superiority over the previously unstoppable invaders, emphasizing the scale and crucial layout of the battlefield that dictated the turning point of world history. Mongolian historical costume painting. A dramatic depiction of the climax of the Battle of Ain Jalut, 1260, showing the Mamluk cavalry erupting from the hidden hills surrounding the valley, trapping the surprised Mongol vanguard led by Kitbuka, emphasize the dust, chaos, and the desperate realization on the Mongol side as they are enveloped by the fresh, disciplined Mamluk troops, highlighting Sultan Qutuz discarding his helmet and charging forward, a pivotal moment of defiance that saved an entire civilization, rendered in the intense detail and rich textures characteristic of a Mongolian historical costume painting. A solemn Mongolian historical costume painting capturing the final moments of General Kitbuka, the Nestorian Christian commander of the Mongol forces, surrounded and fighting fiercely against overwhelming Mamluk numbers in the narrow confines of the Ain Jalut Valley. The image should convey the tragic end of the myth of Mongol invincibility, showcasing his ornate armor and battle-hardened resolve against the backdrop of shattered banners and the overwhelming surge of Mamluk counterattack, emphasizing the high stakes of this world-changing conflict in the year 1600, rendered with historical accuracy regarding military dress and equipment. A monumental diptych presented as a Mongolian historical costume painting, contrasting the terrifying sack of Baghdad in 1258, symbolized by burning libraries and the darkened waters of the Tigris, with the resolute, defiant stand of the Mamluk slave soldiers 2 years later at Ain Jalut. The Mamluk side should feature the stern faces of Qutuz and Baibars preparing for battle, representing the last bastion of resistance against the terror that had swept across Asia, focusing on the weight of history resting on their shoulders during this crucial turning point where the Mongol advance was finally halted.
illustrate the treacherous strategic maneuver of Baybars leading the Mamluk feigned retreat at Ain Jalut, luring the overconfident Mongol heavy cavalry deeper into the trap. The scene is captured as a high-action Mongolian historical costume painting, focusing on the precision of the Mamluk withdrawal amidst a blizzard of arrows, showing the Mongol riders abandoning formation in their pursuit, believing victory was imminent, unaware of the hidden Mamluk main force waiting in the surrounding hills, detailing the speed of the horses and the intricate patterns of the battle formations in the dusty valley.
A richly detailed Mongolian historical costume painting illustrating the volatile moment in Cairo, Mudnanik 1200 Sautid, when Sultan Qutuz, against the counsel of many, orders the execution of Hulegu Khan's arrogant Mongol envoys. Depict the shock and fear on the faces of the remaining Mamluk advisors and the stern, uncompromising defiance of Qutuz, symbolizing the Mamluk refusal to surrender and their commitment to wage the existential war that would culminate at Ain Jalut, showcasing the distinct difference between the Mamluk and Mongol ceremonial attire in the tense court setting. Depict a brutal close-quarters combat scene in the Jezreel Valley during the height of the Battle of Ain Jalut, showcasing the head-on collision between the elite Mamluk heavy cavalry and the swift, devastating Mongolian horse archers. Emphasize the use of lances, scimitars, and the deadly composite bows, rendered in dramatic, dynamic style of a Mongolian historical costume painting, highlighting the exhaustion and desperation of both sides as the fate of the Near East hangs in the balance, a swirling vortex of dust, blood, and clashing steel. A highly technical Mongolian historical costume painting comparing the primary weapons used at Ain Jalut. The unmatched range and power of the Mongol composite recurve bow and the specialized Mamluk armor designed specifically to deflect such projectiles, alongside their curved scimitars. The composition should contrast a Mongol warrior on horseback, drawing his bow at full tension against a determined Mamluk hulam, emphasizing the advanced metallurgy and military training that made this confrontation a deadlock until the Mamluk tactical superiority came into play, set against the arid landscape of northern Palestine. A poignant Mongolian historical costume painting showing the exhausted Mamluk Sultan Qutuz standing amidst the slain Mongol warriors in the valley of Ain Jalut at sunset, September 3, 1260. The air should feel heavy with the silence of victory, the bodies of the previously invincible Mongol hordes lying scattered, symbolizing the profound geopolitical shift caused by the battle. Capture the weary triumph and the heavy realization of the price paid for breaking the myth of Mongol invincibility, rendered in deep twilight colors that emphasize the blood-soaked ground and the distant hills. An evocative Mongolian historical costume painting focusing on the significance of the battleground named Ain Jalut, Goliath's Spring, depicting the moment the Mongol armies, the Goliath of the 13th century world, were finally brought low by the determined Mamluk David. The composition should utilize the surrounding hills and springs to frame the desperate fighting, imbuing the landscape with historical gravity, emphasizing the rugged terrain that Qutuz used to conceal his main force, ensuring that the historical military costumes of both combatants are meticulously detailed.
Mongolian historical costume painting, celebrating the unwavering discipline and fierce determination of the Mamluk slave soldiers, the Gilman, moments before their charge at Ain Jalut. Focus on their highly trained faces, their identical, highly polished armor, and the stark discipline derived from their unique military upbringing, contrasting their forced origins with their newfound role as saviors of the Islamic heartlands against the terror of the Mongol invasion, visually representing their commitment to fighting until the last man to prevent the fall of Cairo. A large-scale panoramic map presented as an ancient Mongolian historical costume painting, illustrating the terrifying geographical extent of the Mongol Empire, stretching from China to the Mediterranean, suddenly and definitively meeting an impenetrable wall at the lines established by the Mamluk victory at Ain Jalut.
highlight the boundary at the Euphrates River, visually symbolizing the moment the global conquering machine ground to a permanent halt, with the Mamluk forces depicted as resolute sentinels guarding the critical gateway to North Africa and Europe against further eastern expansion. A moody, conspiratorial Mongolian historical costume painting depicting the assassination of Sultan Kutuz by Baybars and his co-conspirators during a hunting trip, just 2 months after the heroic victory at Ain Jalut. The contrast should be striking. The celebrated savior of the Islamic world lying fallen, betrayed by the general who helped him win the pivotal battle. This scene must convey the dark political ambition and ruthless reality of the Mamluk court, set against the backdrop of the triumphant return from Palestine, detailing the elaborate hunting attire of the period. Mongolian historical costume painting depicting the ambush at Ain Jalut, where the overconfident Mongol cavalry, chasing the fleeing Mamluks, suddenly realize they are enclosed by fresh Mamluk forces bursting from the surrounding hills in a perfect horseshoe formation, capturing the shock and decisive turning point of the 1260 battle under a desperate desert sky. Mongolian historical costume painting illustrating Sultan Kutuz stripped of his helmet and shouting Islam as he leads the main Mamluk army streaming down from the hidden ridges of Ain Jalut, initiating the counterattack that shatters the seemingly invincible Mongol lines, emphasizing the visceral desperation and spiritual fervor of the Egyptian defenders in 1260. Mongolian historical costume painting portraying the defiant General Kitbuka, the Nestorian Christian commander, surrounded by Mamluk horsemen in the dust-choked valley of Ain Jalut, his face etched with grim determination as he fights against overwhelming odds, a poignant depiction of the moment the Mongol westward expansion was decisively halted on September 3, 1260.
Mongolian historical costume painting, capturing the scene in Cairo, where the arrogant Mongol envoys delivering Hulagu Khan's surrender demand are executed by Sultan Kutuz, emphasizing the severe reaction and the symbolic act of defiance that precedes the mobilization for the fateful clash at Ain Jalut, ensuring the Mamluks will fight to the last man. Mongolian historical costume painting depicting the intense, head-on collision of the swift Mongol light cavalry and the heavily armed Mamluk Kipchak elite warriors during the early stages of the Battle of Ain Jalut, featuring shattered composite bows, drawn scimitars, and rearing horses amidst a cloud of dust and flying arrows, capturing the ferocity of this pivotal medieval conflict. Mongolian historical costume painting, a dark, symbolic depiction where the Mamluk warriors fight with the vengeful ghosts of Baghdad reflected in their eyes, illustrating the desperate struggle at Ain Jalut against the Mongol terror that had previously turned the Tigris River black with the ink of destroyed libraries, showcasing the fight for the survival of Islamic civilization in 1260. Mongolian historical costume painting, illustrating General Baybars expertly leading the feigned retreat of the Mamluk vanguard, drawing the overconfident Mongol pursuing forces deeper into the narrow confines of the valley near Goliath Spring, highlighting the brilliant tactical planning that set the stage for the definitive Mamluk victory and the Mongol demise. Mongolian historical costume painting, capturing a sweeping panoramic view of the Jezreel Valley at Ain Jalut on September 3, 1260, showing the contrasting forces, the disciplined, dark-clad Mamluk formations concealed in the hills, and the scattered, aggressive, yet doomed Mongol cavalry pressing forward into the designated trap, signifying the imminent halt of a global empire. Mongolian historical costume painting,
visualizing the exhausted Mamluk soldiers standing victorious at sunset over the field of Ain Jalut, their faces illuminated by the fading light, surrounded by the corpses of thousands of Mongol warriors and scattered banners, a powerful scene emphasizing the profound realization that they had finally broken the myth of Mongol invincibility. Mongolian historical costume painting, concentrating on the intricate details of the battle, showcasing the superior Mamluk horsemanship and tactical utilization of heavy lances and specialized swords against the rapid-fire devastation of the Mongol composite bows, meticulously detailing the armor and weaponry of both elite cavalries during the climactic fighting in northern Palestine.
Mongolian historical costume painting depicting Hulagu Khan receiving the devastating news of Kitbucha's complete defeat and the destruction of the Tumen at Ain Jalut, illustrating his fury and frustration as the necessity of returning to the succession crisis prevents him from immediately retaliating, symbolizing the definitive end of the Mongol push westward into Egypt. Mongolian historical costume painting conceptualizing the Battle of Ain Jalut not just as a fight, but as a pivotal crossroads of world history, where the Mamluk refusal to yield averted the potential Mongol conquest of North Africa and possibly subsequent invasion of Europe, emphasizing the global consequences hinged upon the determined ferocity of the 20,000 Mamluk cavalry. Visualize the decisive moment at Ain Jalut 1260, where Mamluk reserves surge from the hills in a perfect horseshoe formation, trapping the pursuing, overconfident Mongol heavy cavalry after Baybar's feigned retreat, illustrating the sheer determination of Sultan Qutuz as he casts off his helmet and leads the charge, signaling the world-changing counterattack, rendered in the dramatic, saturated hues typical of a Mongolian historical costume painting. Depict Sultan Qutuz of the Mamluks standing resolute in his tent, contemplating the execution of the arrogant Mongol envoys whose heads will soon adorn Cairo's gates, symbolizing the fierce defiance that prefaced the Battle of Ain Jalut, focusing on the tension and the ornate details of his military attire and the severe expression indicating the willingness to risk everything, presented as a highly detailed Mongolian historical costume painting. Capture the terrifying, irresistible initial charge of the Mongol light cavalry at Ain Jalut, arrows blackening the sky, driven by General Kitbucha's relentless aggression against the Mamluk vanguard, showcasing the speed and composite bows that made them previously undefeated, emphasizing the dust cloud and the sense of impending doom for the initial defenders in the style of a visceral Mongolian historical costume painting. Illustrate the aftermath of the battle in the valley of Ain Jalut at sunset, showing the unprecedented sight of thousands of dead Mongol warriors and scattered banners, symbolizing the shattering of the myth of their invincibility, with victorious, exhausted Mamluk soldiers inspecting the carnage, highlighting the sheer scale of the defeat against the backdrop of Palestinian hills, captured in a somber Mongolian historical costume painting.
Focus on the catastrophic fall of Baghdad in Wutnin Wutnahakanain, Saud Khanshan, preceding the battle, specifically illustrating the tragic scene of priceless illuminated manuscripts and scrolls being cast into the Tigris River, the water visibly stained black with ink, emphasizing the cultural annihilation wrought by Hulagu's army before their movement west, providing a grim context for Mamluk desperation, rendered as a dark, intense Mongolian historical costume painting. Portray the final desperate moments of the Nestorian Mongol general Kitbucha, surrounded by relentless Mamluk horsemen in the confined valley, fighting bravely until his death, representing the last stand of the Mongol invasion force in the Levant, capturing the chaotic close-quarters combat and the determination of the Mamluk circle closing in, detailed beautifully in a fierce Mongolian historical costume painting. An atmospheric view of the Jezreel Valley, Ain Jalut,
depicting the Mamluk main force expertly concealed within the gentle hills and foliage, perfectly positioned for the ambush, patiently awaiting the Mongol pursuit of the decoy force, conveying the strategic brilliance and utilization of terrain that sealed the Mongol fate, utilizing muted colors appropriate for camouflage in a tactical Mongolian historical costume painting. Envision a symbolic map or relief featuring the routes of both the Mongols and Mamluks converging at Ain Jalut, illustrating the potential domino effect had the Mongols won, showing projected invasion lines into North Africa and potentially Europe, Sicily, Spain, emphasizing the immense continent-spanning historical weight of this single engagement, stylized dramatically as a monumental Mongolian historical costume painting. Detail a young Mamluk soldier, recently freed but hardened by rigorous training from childhood in the citadel at Cairo, standing ready for battle, showing the intricate details of his composite armor, finely crafted weapons, and the intensity in his eyes, representing the highly disciplined warrior class that dared to challenge the nomadic hordes, captured with precision in a magnificent Mongolian historical costume painting. Envision a moment of treachery 2 months after the victory, where the ambitious General Baibars and his co-conspirators assassinate Sultan Qutuz during a hunting trip on the road back to Cairo, contrasting the joy of victory with political ruthlessness, showing the shadows and betrayal inherent in the rise of a future great sultan, rendered with dramatic lighting in a conspiratorial Mongolian conspiratorial costume painting.
Create a powerful dual portrait composition showing the two opposing armies, the fierce, swift Mongol horsemen embodying the unstoppable conquest, dramatically clashing against the disciplined, immovable Mamluk ranks, embodying the unbreakable will to defend civilization, symbolizing the pivotal collision of two dominant military cultures on the fateful day of September 3, 1260, rendered vividly as an epic Mongolian historical costume painting. Capture the profound shock and disbelief among the remaining Mongol leadership as news of the catastrophic defeat at Ain Jalut reaches Hulagu Khan back in Persia. Focusing on the moment the aura of invincibility is visibly shattered, showing the messenger arriving amidst the Khan's court, emphasizing the sudden shift from absolute confidence to furious realization of vulnerability, composed as a highly detailed, courtly Mongolian historical costume painting. Depict the moment the Mamluk forces, hidden in the surrounding hills, spring the trap on the pursuing Mongol heavy cavalry in the narrow confines of the Ain Jalut Valley in 1260, focusing on the chaos and shock on the Mongol faces as the horseshoe formation closes, detailed with the intensity of battle and dust kicked up by thousands of horses. Mongolian historical costume painting. A majestic rendering of Sultan Qutuz throwing off his helmet and charging forward, rallying the Mamluk main army during the critical moment of the Battle of Ain Jalut. Capture the desperate resolve and the symbolic weight of the Mamluk counterattack against the previously unstoppable momentum of the Mongol advance, emphasizing the vibrant banners and polished armor contrasting with the dusty battlefield environment. Mongolian historical costume painting. Illustrate the brilliant tactical maneuver of Baibars, leading the Mamluk vanguard in a feigned retreat through the Jezreel Valley, drawing the overconfident Mongol forces commanded by Kitbuka deep into the planned ambush site near Goliath Spring, detailing the swift movement of the light cavalry and the impending doom symbolized by the hidden hillsides waiting to erupt with fresh troops. Mongolian historical costume painting. A poignant portrait of the Mongol general Kitbuka, surrounded and fighting desperately during his final moments at Ain Jalut, his expression reflecting the disbelief and fury of a commander realizing the myth of Mongol invincibility is shattering beneath him, capturing the detailed armor and the intensity of the close-quarters combat against the determined Mamluk swordsmen.
Visualize the immense stakes of the 1260 confrontation, showing a split scene where the destructive aftermath of the siege of Baghdad 1258 shadows the determined faces of the Mamluk soldiers marching north from Cairo, signifying that the survival of the Islamic heartland rests entirely on the outcome of the impending battle in Palestine. Mongolian historical costume painting.
Focus on the brutal collision Kutu's the elite cavalry forces, the swift, composite bow-wielding Mongol horse archers, and the heavily armored, lance-bearing Mamluk gulams during the initial engagement at Ain Jalut, emphasizing the sheer kinetic energy of the impact and the flurry of arrows darkening the September sky in the open terrain of the valley. Mongolian historical costume painting. A dramatic depiction showing the retreating remnants of the Mongol army from Syria fleeing back toward Persia, contrasting this desperate flight with a secondary image of the powerful Hulegu Khan receiving the shocking news of the unprecedented defeat at Ain Jalut, his visage contorted in disbelief and rage over the failure of his Western campaign. Mongolian historical costume painting. Conceptualize the historical turning point, a vast, swirling tidal wave representing the Mongol Empire's expansion, reaching China, Persia, and Syria, suddenly meeting an unmovable stone wall represented by the unified Mamluk shield wall at Ain Jalut, symbolizing the final western limit of the Great Eurasian Empire in the year 1260. Mongolian historical costume painting. Portray the disciplined Mamluk warriors, former slave soldiers rigorously trained since boyhood in warfare, strategy, and horsemanship, preparing for the decisive campaign against the Mongol hordes. Detail their sophisticated armor and weapons, contrasting their organized preparation with the feared, ruthless reputation of their nomadic opponents. Mongolian historical costume painting. A symbolic view of the Ain Jalut battlefield, Goliath Spring, just after the final Mongol rout, showing the Mamluk troops standing victorious amidst the wreckage and bodies of the defeated Mongols, their relief and exhaustion palpable, highlighting the specific geographical features that enabled the perfect ambush strategy. Mongolian historical costume painting. Capture the intense moment of the Mongol initial assault, showing a panoramic view of the valley filled with thousands of Mongol riders unleashing volleys of arrows from their powerful composite bows, attempting to break the Mamluk lines, detailing the distinctive Mongol uniform and the sheer density of the projectile attack against the Mamluk shields. Astrikten the Ain Jalut conferring over tactical maps just before the battle, emphasizing their shared resolve to fight while subtly hinting at the future betrayal and Kutu's assassination that would follow the monumental victory, focusing on regal attire and military planning. Depict the moment Kutus throws off his helmet, revealing the hidden Mamluk main force emerging from the surrounding hills of Ain Jalut, instantly turning the Mongol pursuit of Baybar's cavalry into a devastating encirclement. Emphasize the dramatic contrast between the unsuspecting Mongol horde pouring into the valley and the meticulously hidden, fresh Mamluk lines, rendered in the intense, detailed aesthetic of a Mongolian historical costume painting. Illustrate the chaotic, dust-choked scene of Baybar's elite Mamluk vanguard executing the crucial feigned retreat through the Jezreel Valley, drawing the aggressive, overconfident Mongol heavy cavalry deeper into the prepared killing zone, capturing the desperate tension and strategic precision required for this maneuver, portrayed with the rich textures and ceremonial accuracy characteristic of a Mongolian historical costume painting. A powerful close-up composition focusing on General Kit Buka, the Nestorian Mongol commander, surrounded and fighting desperately as the Mamluk forces close in, symbolizing the fracturing of the invincible Mongol mythos. Capture the intensity of his final moments amidst the swirl of battle standards and shattered bows,
executed in a heroic yet tragic style typical of a detailed Mongolian historical costume painting. Envision the battle at its peak, where the Mongols, driven by the knowledge that this is the final defense of their civilization, are pushing back against the Mongols in a brutal cavalry engagement at the center of the valley. Focus on the visual chaos of colliding lances and the fierce determination in the Mongol eyes, versus the sudden disbelief of the Mongols, realized as a sweeping, dramatic Mongolian historical costume painting. A stylized portrayal of Sultan Kutos in Cairo, standing defiantly before the heads of the executed Mongol envoys staked outside the city gates, reflecting his audacious choice to fight rather than capitulate, thereby saving the Islamic world. The scene should convey the immense political tension and high stakes of this pivotal historical moment, rendered in the meticulous detail of a formal Mongolian historical costume painting, though focusing on the Mamluk leader's resolve. A metaphorical painting contrasting the swift, relentless forward momentum of the charging Mongol Tumans, symbolized by swift horses and flying arrows, against the suddenly solidified, unyielding defense line of the Mamluk reserves, representing the moment the Mongol expansion was physically halted at Ain Jalut, requiring the stylistic detail and dramatic flair of a grand Mongolian historical costume painting.
The desolate landscape of En Jalut at sunset following the battle, emphasizing the overwhelming loss suffered by the Mongols, with shattered equipment and fallen warriors scattered across the valley floor, illustrating the grim cost of the Mamluk victory and the finality of the Mongol defeat, captured in the dark, evocative tones suitable for a monumental Mongolian historical costume painting. Focus on the terrifying effectiveness of the Mongol light cavalry raining down arrows from their powerful composite bows during the initial engagement against the Mamluk vanguard, highlighting the superior range and lethality that defined their military dominance before the trap was sprung, depicted with keen attention to weapon and armor detail inherent in a Mongolian historical costume painting. Showcase a disciplined unit of Mamluk slave soldiers, stern-faced and heavily armored, maintaining perfect formation while concealed in the hills, patiently awaiting Kutuz's signal, emphasizing their elite training and unwavering resolve in the face of the supposedly invincible enemy, depicted through the rich cultural lens of a historical artwork, contrasted against the specific requirements of a Mongolian historical costume painting style. An allegorical representation of the battle itself, showing the dividing line between the inevitable conquest of the Islamic heartland and its miraculous survival, illustrating the historical significance of En Jalut as a nexus point where global fate was decided in the dust of Palestine, presented as an epic, highly stylized panorama using the visual language of a traditional Mongolian historical costume painting. Imagine the scene where Hulagu Khan in Persia receives the devastating news of the defeat and the death of Kitbuka at En Jalut, capturing his ferocious anger and frustration at the first major check to the Mongol tide, utilizing dramatic expressions and imperial settings typical of a historical narrative artwork, specifically rendered in the intricate style of a Mongolian historical costume painting. A dual-scene composition showing the victorious Mamluk army celebrating the survival of their civilization, contrasted sharply with a darker, foreboding segment depicting Baibars planning the assassination of Sultan Kutuz shortly after the battle, encapsulating the complex mix of triumph and internal political strife, executed in the vivid, narrative style of a grand Mongolian historical costume painting. Mongolian historical costume painting of the critical moment at En Jalut, where the hidden Mamluk forces, led by Sultan Kutuz throwing off his helmet, burst forth from the surrounding hills to encircle the pursuing Mongol cavalry, emphasizing the shock and chaos of the ambush in the valley, rendered with rich historical detail and dramatic lighting. A dramatic Mongolian historical costume painting depicting the final moments of the Mongol general Kitbuka at the Battle of Ain Jalut, showing him surrounded by ferocious Mamluk cavalry, maintaining a defiant stance with his banner-bearer fallen nearby, capturing the desperation and eventual defeat of the previously invincible contingent, illuminated by the harsh desert sun of northern Palestine. Detailed Mongolian historical costume painting illustrating the meticulously planned feigned retreat led by Baybar's Mamluk vanguard, successfully luring the overly confident Mongol heavy cavalry deep into the preset trap in the valley of Ain Jalut, capturing the speed and tactical precision of the Mongol horsemen, contrasting with the aggressive, disorganized pursuit of the Mongols under a dusty sky. A solemn Mongolian historical costume painting portraying Sultan Qutuz of the Mamluks standing resolute in Cairo after ordering the execution of the arrogant Mongol envoys, his gaze fixed eastward toward the looming threat, symbolizing the monumental decision to fight rather than capitulate, a pivotal act of defiance before the mobilization for the clash at Ain Jalut. Mongolian historical costume painting focusing on the aftermath of the battle, featuring scattered Mongol banners broken on the ground, with Mamluk warriors surveying the field of Ain Jalut, symbolizing the shattering of the myth of Mongol invincibility and the definitive end of their westward expansion into the Levant, executed in a muted color palette to convey the solemn, historical weight of the event. Epic-scale Mongolian historical costume painting capturing the ferocious cavalry charge of the Mamluk army, specifically highlighting their elite Turkish Kipchak heritage and weaponry, smashing directly into the disorganized flanks of the surprised Mongol forces within the confines of the valley, emphasizing the raw force and disciplined coordination that led to the turning point victory on that fateful day in 1260. A conceptual Mongolian historical costume painting visualizing the immense geopolitical weight of the Battle of Ain Jalut, showing the clash of the two armies positioned between symbolic representations of the collapsing Abbasid East and the threatened Mamluk West, Egypt, illustrating this single battle as the historical choke point that preserved Islamic civilization and prevented further Mongol incursions into Africa. Highly detailed Mongolian historical costume painting focusing on the intense exchange of composite bow archery between the highly skilled Mongol horse archers and the Mamluk gulams during the initial skirmish phase of Ain Jalut, demonstrating the range and power of both sides' specialized weaponry, the air thick with flying arrows, rendered in the hyper-realistic style typical of court manuscripts.
Mongolian historical costume painting illustrating the strategic withdrawal of Hulagu Khan and the bulk of the Mongol army from Syria following the death Gwomek Khan, leaving Kitbuka dangerously exposed, capturing the hurried movement and logistical complexity of the vast Mongol horde moving eastward, setting the stage for the Mamluk opportunity at Ain Jalut weeks later. A poignant Mongolian historical costume painting showing the Mamluk soldiers, former slave warriors trained since childhood, kneeling in prayer before the decisive battle, their faces etched with fierce determination, recognizing that they are the final barrier against the destruction of the Levant, invoking themes of destiny and unwavering loyalty amidst overwhelming odds at Ain Jalut. Evocative Mongolian historical costume painting juxtaposing the fiery destruction of Baghdad 1258 in the background, symbolized by the ink-blackened Tigris River, with the determined advance of the Mamluk army toward Ain Jalut in the foreground, highlighting their desperate refusal to allow the same catastrophic fate to befall Cairo, illustrating the high emotional and historical stakes of their campaign. Intriguing Mongolian historical costume painting juxtaposing the fiery destruction of Baghdad 1258 in the background, symbolized by the ink-blackened Tigris River, with the determined advance of the Mamluk army toward Ain Jalut in the foreground,
highlighting their desperate refusal to allow the same catastrophic fate to befall Cairo, illustrating the high emotional and historical stakes of their campaign. Intriguing Mongolian historical costume painting depicting the dark irony of history, General Baybars, the tactical victor of Ain Jalut, standing in shadow moments before the assassination of Sultan Qutuz during a hunting trip, illustrating the immediate political fallout and subsequent power transition that followed the monumental military success, capturing the ambition and ruthlessness in Mamluk governance. Depict the moment Sultan Qutuz casts off his helmet and charges forward, rallying the hidden Mamluk reserves from the surrounding hills during the pivotal encirclement at Ain Jalut in 1260, emphasizing the desperate determination and the sudden shift in the battle's momentum against the unsuspecting Mongol cavalry, capturing the dusty chaos and the high stakes of this historical confrontation, rendered in the meticulous detail of a classical, vibrant Mongolian historical costume painting. Illustrate General Baybars leading the feigned Mamluk retreat, drawing the overconfident Mongol heavy cavalry deeper into the trap laid in the expansive Jezreel Valley just moments before the full ambush is sprung, showcasing the speed and composite bows of the Mongol pursuit juxtaposed with the disciplined maneuver of the Mamluk light forces, utilizing the rich colors and dramatic compositions typical of a fine Mongolian historical costume painting.
A portrait with the doomed Mongol general Kitbukha, a Nestorian Christian, moments before his capture and death at Ain Jalut, showing his shocked realization of the perfect Mamluk ambush, his face weathered by countless campaigns, dressed in intricate 13th century war attire and surrounded by the swirling dust of battle, capturing the tragic end of the myth of Mongol invincibility, styled as an evocative Mongolian historical costume painting. Visualize the geological setting of Ain Jalut, Goliath Spring, a wide-open valley framed by concealing hills during the 1260 conflict, filled with the clash of 20,000 Mamluks and the remnants of Hulegu's contingent, focusing on the strategic significance of the terrain that enabled the perfect trap to be sprung, capturing the moment the Mongol western advance ground to a halt, executed in the detailed cultural style of a Mongolian historical costume painting. The desolate scene immediately following the battle, showing Mongol warriors standing victorious but exhausted amidst the bodies of slain Mongol horses and fallen soldiers, the setting sun casting long shadows across the valley floor, symbolizing the end of the Mongol western sweep and the salvation of the Levant, a somber depiction of hard-won victory and global historical change, created as a powerful Mongolian historical costume painting. Detailed depiction of the Mamluk Bahri Sultanate cavalry, renowned for their discipline and lamellar armor, engaging in close-quarters combat against the swift, hardened, fur-trimmed Mongol horsemen, illustrating the brutal intensity of the fighting where skill and sheer desperation outweighed numerical odds, emphasizing the specialized weaponry and unique cultural armor of both sides, presented as a dramatic, highly detailed Mongolian historical costume painting. A conceptual split image illustrating the destruction of Baghdad, Tigris water blackened by ink, 1258, contrasted sharply with the desperate fight for survival at Ain Jalut, 1260, symbolizing the stakes involved for the Islamic civilization, where the Mamluks fought not just for land, but for cultural survival against the overwhelming terror previously unleashed by Hulegu Khan, executed in a historical panorama style reminiscent of a striking Mongolian historical costume painting. Capture the initial brutal impact of the Mongol advance guard meeting Baybar's Mamluk screen, a deluge of composite bow arrows darkening the sky over the Jezreel Valley, highlighting the legendary speed and coordination of the Mongol tactics before they realized the enemy was preparing a retreat lure, an intense depiction of 13th century mounted warfare tactics, visualized in the rich, traditional aesthetic of a Mongolian historical costume painting.
A dramatic, artistic rendition of the Mongol envoys in Cairo before the battle, delivering Hulagu's arrogant demands of surrender to Sultan Qutuz, contrasting the lavish but doomed confidence of the Mongols with the cold, unforgiving resolve of the Mamluk court that decided to execute the messengers and fight, capturing the political tension that preceded the Great Clash. Styled as a sophisticated Mongolian historical costume painting. Visualize General Baibars, the brilliant field commander, observing the aftermath of the successful battle, his face illuminated by a calculated ambition that foreshadows his eventual regicide of Qutuz 2 months later, subtly weaving the internal Mamluk political drama into the triumphant military victory scene, rendering the complex character dynamics required to save a civilization, depicted as a symbolic, narrative Mongolian historical costume painting. A visceral depiction of the moment the trapped Mongol forces realize they are completely surrounded in the valley, illustrating the sudden chaos and confusion as Mamluk cavalry streams down the slopes from 3 directions, shattering the previously perfect Mongol battle formation, showing the breakdown of discipline under overwhelming pressure, a historical study in tactical failure and success, realized through the lens of a powerful Mongolian historical costume painting. Focus on the Euphrates River, the eventual stable boundary line established after Ain Jalut, showing Mamluk patrols defiantly guarding the riverbank against further eastern incursions, symbolizing the permanent halt of the Mongol westward expansion and the establishment of a fixed border that protected Egypt and the Levant for centuries, a scene emphasizing stoicism and defensive posture, visualized in the commemorative style of a Mongolian historical costume painting. A dramatic, wide-angle depiction of the moment Sultan Qutuz throws off his helmet and charges, signaling the trap at Ain Jalut. Fresh Mamluk cavalry bursts from the concealed valleys, flanking the overextended, pursuing Mongol horsemen under the harsh Palestinian sun, showcasing the overwhelming determination of the outnumbered defenders against the surprised invaders, rendered in the intense detail of a Mongolian historical costume painting. A fierce portrait of General Kitbuka, the Nestorian Christian commander of the Mongol detachment, surrounded in the swirling dust of the battlefield, desperately rallying his shattered troops against the relentless Mamluk onslaught during the climax of Ain Jalut, capturing the moment the myth of Mongol invincibility was irrevocably broken, emphasizing the detailed armor in a cinematic Mongolian historical costume painting.
Depict the brilliant tactical feigned retreat led by Baibars, showing the disciplined Mamluk vanguard executing a synchronized turn, drawing the aggressive, unsuspecting Mongol heavy cavalry deeper into the prepared valley trap at Ain Jalut, highlighting the complex maneuver and the speed of the mounted archers in a striking, action-focused Mongolian historical costume painting. A somber, post-battle scene at dusk in the valley of Ain Jalut, showing the Mamluk forces surveying the field littered with fallen Mongol warriors and horses, symbolizing the definitive halt of the great westward expansion, the lighting emphasizing the exhaustion and the profound historical weight of the Mamluk victory, rendered as a reflective Mongolian historical costume painting. Illustrate the high tension in Cairo as Sultan Qutuz stands defiantly over the freshly severed heads of Hulagu Khan's arrogant messengers, publicly rejecting demand for surrender and signaling immediate war against the feared Mongol Empire, detailing the ornate Egyptian court attire contrasted with the simplified traveling robes of the envoys, presented as a high-detail Mongolian historical costume painting. An epic, low-angle view capturing the terrifying momentum of the 50,000 Mongol warriors before their defeat, charging across the plains of northern Palestine, their composite bows drawn, arrows darkening the sky, showcasing their terrifying coordination and speed as they believed victory was certain, vividly rendered with dynamic motion in a dramatic Mongolian historical costume painting. Focus on Sultan Kutuz in the heat of the main engagement, riding forward without his helmet, brandishing his sword and shouting "Islam" to inspire his wavering Mamluk troops to hold the line against the desperate Mongol counterattacks in the gorge, emphasizing the raw leadership and personal courage that turned the tide. Portrayed in a vibrant, close-up Mongolian historical costume painting. A detailed depiction of the brutal close-quarters combat between the heavily armored Mamluk Gilman cavalry, trained slave soldiers, utilizing curved scimitars and lances, engaging the lighter, swift Mongol horse archers and lancers, showcasing the stark contrast in weaponry and fighting styles during the brutal, hours-long engagement at Ain Jalut, captured in a historically rich Mongolian historical costume painting. Visualize the invisible boundary formed at Ain Jalut, featuring Mongol riders halted abruptly, looking westward across a desert landscape towards a defiant, shimmering mirage of Cairo, illustrating the geographical and historical limit of their conquests, capturing the immense strategic importance of this single battle in a highly symbolic and richly colored Mongolian historical costume painting. A detailed depiction of the brutal close-quarters combat between the heavily armored Mamluk Gilman cavalry, trained slave soldiers, utilizing curved scimitars and lances, engaging the lighter, swift Mongol horse archers and lancers, showcasing the stark contrast in weaponry and fighting styles during the brutal, hours-long engagement at Ain Jalut, captured in a historically rich Mongolian historical costume painting. Visualize the invisible boundary formed at Ain Jalut, featuring Mongol riders halted abruptly, looking westward across a desert landscape towards a defiant, shimmering mirage, illustrating the geographical and historical limit of their conquests, capturing the immense strategic importance of this single battle in a highly symbolic and richly colored Mongolian historical costume painting.
A detailed study of a Mamluk cavalryman, demonstrating his elite training and specialized armor adapted for desert warfare, standing ready before the Battle of Ain Jalut, emphasizing the discipline and resolute posture of these former slave soldiers, highlighting the intricate textile patterns and metalwork typical of the Egyptian Sultanate military, presented as a majestic Mongolian historical costume painting. A panoramic view showing the complete tactical confusion of the surrounded Mongol forces trapped within the narrow valley, desperately trying to break out of the Mamluk horseshoe formation, with dust clouds rising high and the sun blinding the fighters, perfectly illustrating the catastrophic execution of Kutuz's encirclement plan, realized in a sweeping, chaotic Mongolian historical costume painting. Depict the ambitious General Baibars, mud-splattered and victorious, gazing intensely across the battlefield immediately after the rout of the Mongols, his expression hinting at the political maneuverings and assassination that would follow his military triumph, capturing the complexity of his character against the backdrop of the defining victory in a dramatic and psychologically rich Mongolian historical costume painting. A dramatic depiction of the Mamluk Sultan Kutuz, helmet cast aside, charging out from the concealing hills of Ain Jalut, leading his cavalry into the valley below, where the surprised Mongol pursuers are suddenly encircled by fresh, determined Egyptian forces. Capture the overwhelming realization of the trap dawning on General Kitbuka's face amidst the chaos of the massive cavalry clash, emphasizing the tactical brilliance of the maneuver against the backdrop of the dusty Jeril Valley, rendered in the meticulous detail of a Mongolian historical costume painting. A dynamic scene capturing the feigned retreat orchestrated by Mamluk General Baibars, showing his light cavalry turning their horses and galloping away while looking over their shoulders, successfully drawing the swift, aggressive Mongol pursuit deeper into the pre-planned ambush zone. Detail the dust cloud kicked up by the rapid maneuver and the triumphant yet calculating expressions of the Mamluks as they execute the critical opening phase of the battle, stylized as a dramatic Mongolian historical costume painting.
Visualize the intense final moments of the Mongol general Kitbuka, a Nestorian Christian, fighting valiantly but hopelessly surrounded by relentless Mamluk heavy cavalry within the suffocating confines of the Ain Jalut Valley. Show the broken lines of his once invincible army, scattering in disarray as he meets his end, a pivotal moment marking the absolute cessation of the Mongol advance into the Levant, crafted with vibrant colors and expressive detail characteristic of a Mongolian historical costume painting. A dynamic scene capturing the feigned retreat orchestrated by Mamluk General Aybars, showing his light cavalry turning their horses and galloping away while looking over their shoulders, successfully drawing the swift, aggressive Mongol pursuit deeper into the pre-planned ambush zone. Detailed the dust cloud kicked up by the rapid maneuver, and the triumphant yet calculating expressions of the Mamluks as they execute the critical opening phase of the battle, stylized as a dramatic Mongolian historical costume painting.
Illustrate the overwhelming thought-seeing psychological pressure facing the supposedly unbeatable Mongol army. Depict a frontline Mamluk soldier bracing for the impact of the initial Mongol arrow storm and cavalry charge, embodying unwavering resolve against the terror that had consumed Baghdad and Damascus. The composition should emphasize the stark contrast between the relentless Mongol war machine and the desperate yet organized resistance of the Mamluk slave warriors, presented in the vivid, narrative style of a Mongolian historical costume painting. A poignant, twilight scene showing Sultan Qutuz standing on the blood-soaked ground of Ain Jalut, surrounded by the silence of victory and the fallen bodies of thousands of Mongol warriors, confirming the impossible defeat. The lowering sun casts long shadows over the valley, symbolizing the end of the Mongol westward dominance and the dawn of a new era for the Islamic world, rendered with deep emotional resonance and attention to armor details typical of a Mongolian historical costume painting. A highly kinetic image focusing on the density and intensity of the arrow storm over Ain Jalut, where the air is thick with countless projectiles fired by both Mongol and Mamluk composite bows. Highlight the precision and deadliness of these medieval weapons as they rain down upon the opposing cavalry formations, emphasizing the tactical importance of ranged combat in this specific historical confrontation, stylized meticulously as a chaotic and intense Mongolian historical costume painting. Visualize the impenetrable formation of the Mamluk heavy cavalry, disciplined former slave soldiers, holding their positions staunchly as the initial wave of the famed Mongol light cavalry impact them. Depict the resilience and sophisticated training of the Mamluks, showcasing their superior armor and close-quarters fighting skill, contrasting sharply with the speed and maneuverability of their opponents, immortalized in the rich detail and historical accuracy of a Mongolian historical costume painting. A highly kinetic image focusing on the density and intensity of the arrow storm over Ain Jalut, where the air is thick with countless projectiles fired by both Mongol and Mamluk composite bows. Highlight the precision and deadliness of these medieval weapons as they rain down upon the opposing cavalry formations, emphasizing the tactical importance of ranged combat in this specific historical confrontation, stylized meticulously as a chaotic and intense Mongolian historical costume painting. Visualize the impenetrable formation of the Mamluk heavy cavalry, disciplined former slave soldiers, holding their position staunchly as the initial wave of the famed Mongol light cavalry impact them. Depict the resilience and sophisticated training of the Mamluks, showcasing their superior armor and close-quarters fighting skill, contrasting sharply with the speed and maneuverability of their opponents, immortalized in the rich detail and historical accuracy of a Mongolian historical costume painting.
A symbolic representation moment, world history shifted in the valley of Ain Jalut, show the giant, irresistible wave of the Mongol Empire crashing into an unmoving, stone-like bastion representing the Mamluk Sultanate, with the new, permanent western frontier defined by the line of conflict. Incorporate elements of shattered banners and broken composite bows littering the foreground,
illustrating the end of the relentless global conquest, executed as a powerful Mongolian historical costume painting. Depict the dramatic moment in Cairo where Sultan Qutuz makes the fateful decision to execute the arrogant Mongol envoys, rejecting their demand for immediate capitulation. Illustrate the tension and gravity in the royal court, with the severed heads later displayed publicly on stakes outside the city gates, demonstrating the Mamluk defiance that precipitated the battle, captured with dramatic lighting and architectural detail in the style of a Mongolian historical costume painting. An ultra-detailed close-up visualization of the fierce hand-to-hand combat between Mamluk and Mongol horsemen in the confined space of the valley, emphasizing the clash of scimitars, maces, and lances. Highlight the difference in armor and fighting styles, showing the brutal and exhausting nature of the sustained engagement under the hot September sun, capturing the intensity and violence with the intricate brushwork of a Mongolian historical costume painting. A highly energized portrayal of Sultan Qutuz personally leading the decisive countercharge, shouting "Islam" as he rallies his men, knowing that the survival of their entire civilization rests on this single desperate thrust. Capture the raw fury and religious fervor driving the Mamluks break the encircled Mongol ranks, utilizing dynamic composition and flowing movement characteristic of a masterpiece Mongolian historical costume painting. Mongolian historical costume painting depicting the dramatic moment Sultan Qutuz casts off his helmet and emerges from the hidden hills of Ayan Jalut, leading the Mamluk main force in a furious charge against the unsuspecting, overextended Mongol cavalry pursuing Baibars, emphasizing the dusty, chaotic nature of the ambush and the brilliant tactical execution that sealed the fate of the Mongol advance in 1260. Mongolian historical costume painting illustrating the cunning, feigned retreat led by Mamluk General Baibars, drawing the victorious but complacent Mongol hordes deeper into the narrow confines of the Ayan Jalut Valley, showcasing the speed and desperation of the Mamluk vanguard, contrasted with the aggressive, relentless pursuit of the Mongol horse archers under the hot September sun, setting the stage for the massive, career-defining ambush.
Mongolian historical costume painting, portraying the defiant Sultan Qutuz in his war tent in Cairo, dramatically ordering the execution of Hulagu Khan's arrogant messengers, whose severed heads are later displayed on pikes, capturing the profound political and military resolve of the Mamluk leader to fight to the last man rather than submit, thereby securing the future survival of the Islamic world against the seemingly unstoppable empire. Mongolian historical costume painting, a tragic depiction of the final stand of General Kitbuka, the Nestorian Christian commander of the remaining Mongol forces, surrounded by fierce Mamluk heavy cavalry in the bloody mud of Ain Jalut, his face etched with disbelief as his undefeated army is systematically broken and routed, symbolizing the definitive end of the myth of Mongol invincibility in the Levant. Mongolian historical costume painting, an epic panorama view of the Ain Jalut battlefield at sunset, showing the Mamluk standards raised high over the corpses of thousands of slain Mongol warriors and horses, illustrating the exhausted but triumphant Mamluk soldiers recognizing their historical achievement of halting the largest contiguous empire humanity had ever seen, forever changing the geopolitical trajectory of the world. Mongolian historical costume painting, an intense close-up visualization of the decisive cavalry engagement between the elite Mamluk slave soldiers wielding sharp scimitars and lances and the highly disciplined Mongol mounted archers, highlighting the brutal face-to-face clash where superior Mamluk resolve and heavy armor overcame the traditional speed and range advantages of the fearsome steppe warriors during the height of the chaotic melee.
Mongolian historical costume painting, a stylized dark representation reflecting the horrific events leading up to Ain Jalut, specifically depicting the Tigris River running black with the ink of countless destroyed scholarly texts from Baghdad, juxtaposed with the determined, vengeful expressions of the Mamluk forces preparing to ensure that similar intellectual and cultural destruction would not reach Cairo. Mongolian historical costume painting, a split portrait showing the stern, determined face of Sultan Qutuz, symbolizing the refusal to surrender, contrasted with the confident, battle-hardened visage of General Kitbuka, representing the hubris of the previously undefeated Mongol war machine, capturing the high stakes of the 1260 confrontation that would decide the fate of two vast empires and the future of the Middle East. Mongolian historical costume painting, focusing on the dynamic action of a Mongol tumen unleashing volleys of arrows from powerful composite bows while galloping at full speed, showcasing the terrifying effectiveness of their signature mounted archery tactics just moments before they realize they have been fully enveloped by the concealed Mamluk regiments within the trap at Ain Jalut.
Mongolian historical costume painting, illustrating the highly trained Mamluk slave soldiers, former captured boys from Turkic and Circassian lands, demonstrating their elite discipline and synchronized military movements amidst the chaos of battle, reflecting the years of rigorous training in strategy and horsemanship that allowed them to finally outmaneuver and defeat the Mongol cavalry at the critical turning point of history. Mongolian historical costume painting, an aerial perspective showing the layout of the Ain Jalut Valley, Goliath Spring, depicting the vast scale of the Mamluk horseshoe formation successfully trapping the advancing Mongol forces, emphasizing the strategic importance of the terrain utilized by Qutuz to negate the Mongol numerical superiority and maximize the impact of the surprise attack in the field. Mongolian historical costume painting, a complex scene depicting the victorious Mamluk generals on the hunt 2 months after Ain Jalut, specifically focusing on Baybar's cunning and ruthless ambition as he secretly orchestrates the assassination of his sultan, Qutuz, illustrating the deadly internal politics that immediately followed the greatest military victory against the Mongols, securing Baybar's eventual ascension to power. Depict the pivotal moment the Mongol cavalry realizes they have ridden into the Mamluk trap at Ain Jalut, showing General Kitbuka's forces utterly surrounded by fresh, determined Mamluk horsemen bursting forth from the hidden hillsides, capturing the shock and desperation of the exposed Mongols under the unforgiving September sun, highlighting the dust, chaos, and overwhelming tactical surprise in a dramatic, high-detail scene rendered in the specific genre of a majestic Mongolian historical costume painting. A powerful portrait of Sultan Qutuz casting off his helmet and charging forward, his face a mask of desperate resolve and strategic brilliance, rallying the hidden Mamluk main force with the cry, "Islam," as they launch the devastating counterattack against the pursuing overextended Mongol horde in the narrow confines of the valley. Emphasizing the heavy armor and disciplined formation of the Mamluk elite, captured vividly as a detailed Mongolian historical costume painting. An evocative scene showing the immediate aftermath of the battle, where the myth of Mongol invincibility shatters entirely. Tattered banners lie broken on the dusty valley floor, littered with fallen horses and composite bows, while scattered Mongol warriors flee desperately back towards Syria, pursued relentlessly by the victorious Mamluk light cavalry, symbolizing the permanent halt of the Western conquest, presented as an expansive and somber Mongolian historical costume painting.
Illustrate the tactical feint led by General Baybars, showing the Mamluk vanguard executing a disciplined, calculated retreat, while the overconfident Mongol cavalry, believing victory is certain, presses aggressively forward deeper into the killing zone of Ain Jalut Valley, detailing the intense exchange of arrows and the perfect execution of the planned deception,
conceptualized as an elaborate strategic moment in a Mongolian historical costume painting. A tragic depiction of the final, desperate stand of the Nestorian Christian Mongol general Kitbuka, fighting fiercely but hopelessly surrounded by relentless Mamluk soldiers in the heart of the valley, acknowledging his skill and bravery even in defeat, showcasing the brutal, close-quarters combat that characterized the battle's climax beneath a turbulent sky, rendered with dark, dramatic lighting suitable for a poignant Mongolian historical costume painting. Juxtapose the immense shadow cast by the preceding destruction of Baghdad, symbolized by distant smoldering ruins and smoke on the horizon, with the defiant Mamluk army preparing for their last stand near Ain Jalut, illustrating their role as the final bastion of resistance against Hulagu Khan's destructive forces, immortalized in the style of a grand, historically significant panorama within a Mongolian historical costume painting. Emphasize the sheer kinetic energy of the two massive cavalry forces colliding violently under the bright Palestinian sky, focusing specifically on the highly trained Mamluk horse archers meeting the equally skilled Mongol riders head-on, capturing the critical moment of maximum impact where thousands of horses and men meet in a deafening crescendo of war, designed as a dynamic, action-packed Mongolian historical costume painting. A wide, topographical view of the Jezreel Valley at Ain Jalut, showing the brilliant strategic disposition, the main Mamluk army concealed perfectly within the rolling hills forming the horseshoe trap, while Baibar's small force engages the full weight of the Mongol pursuit deep in the open fields, illustrating the critical use of terrain that secured the impossible victory, presented with geographical precision in a detailed Mongolian historical costume painting. Depict the initial terrifying confidence of the Mongol army prior to the battle, showcasing their famed discipline, the distinct look of their light armor, and the effectiveness of their composite bows, representing the seemingly unstoppable force that had recently annihilated empires and brought unparalleled terror across the known world, captured in an intimidating and geometrically precise Mongolian historical costume painting. A detailed close-up of the Mamluk warriors, former slave soldiers trained rigorously from boyhood, standing defiant and resolute, knowing they face an enemy that has never been beaten. Their weathered expressions reflecting the desperate commitment required to save their entire civilization from certain destruction, contrasting their individual resolve against the backdrop of the massive looming conflict, executed in a masterful Mongolian historical costume painting. A symbolic representation of the battle, where the relentless volley of Mongol arrows, signifying their tactical dominance and centuries of military success, is finally deflected or stopped mid-flight by the impenetrable shield wall of determined Mamluk forces, signifying the crucial moment the tide turned and the tactical superiority of the Mamluks prevailed through disciplined strategy, focusing on light and shadow in a dramatic style of Mongolian historical costume painting. Illustrate the Mamluk army's triumphant return to Cairo, celebrating their monumental victory over the Mongols, but subtly foreshadowing the impending political turmoil by including a hidden, darker corner where General Baibars and his co-conspirators plot the swift assassination of Sultan Qutuz amidst the general celebratory chaos, blending themes of military triumph and political betrayal into a complex narrative Mongolian historical costume painting. A dramatic Mongolian historical costume painting depicting the decisive moment at Ain Jalut, September 1260, where Sultan Qutuz, helmet cast aside, leads the hidden Mamluk main force erupting from the Judean hills, encircling the pursuing, overextended Mongol cavalry commanded by Kitbuka. Capture the shock of the Mongols realizing the perfect trap amidst the dust and thunder of 20,000 charging Mamluk horsemen, rendered with meticulous detail on armor, banners, and composite bows, emphasizing the fate of the Levant resting on this desperate maneuver, breaking the myth of invincibility.
Generate a powerful Mongolian historical costume painting illustrating the cunning prelude to victory at Ain Jalut. Depict the brilliant Mamluk general Baybars leading a controlled, feigned retreat of his armored Egyptian cavalry, skillfully drawing the arrogant Mongol vanguard under Kitbuka into the narrow valley where Kutuz waits hidden. Focus on the stark contrast between the heavy, determined Mamluk armor and the swift, seemingly unstoppable Mongol horse archers during this crucial, high-stakes maneuver that determined the boundary of the largest contiguous empire in history, capturing the tension of the battle initiation.
Depicting the critical moment during the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, where the Mamluk forces, hidden in the surrounding hills, spring the deadly trap upon the pursuing Mongol cavalry, emphasizing the shock and chaos as the previously invincible Mongol ranks realize they are completely surrounded in the valley, a dramatic scene rendered in the specific high-detail aesthetic of a Mongolian historical costume painting. A detailed portrayal of the Mongol general Kitbuka, the Nestorian Christian commander left in charge, fighting valiantly and desperately against the overwhelming Mamluk surge after the ambush, showing his elaborate armor and final moments of resistance before his capture or death in the valley of Ain Jalut, a poignant depiction of a pivotal historical defeat, capturing the intensity and drama typical of Mongolian historical costume painting. Visualize the brilliant tactical maneuver orchestrated by Baybars, the Mamluk vanguard executing the crucial feigned retreat to lure the confident, pursuing Mongol hordes deep into the trap at Ain Jalut, capturing the speed and dusty chaos of the retreating Mamluk horsemen, contrasting sharply with the relentless, aggressive charge of the Mongol warriors, all meticulously detailed in the majestic form of a Mongolian historical costume painting. A stunning vertical panorama showing Sultan Kutuz throwing off his helmet and shouting "Islam" to rally his concealed troops, commanding the main Mamluk army to burst forth from the hillsides to complete the encirclement of the Mongol invaders, highlighting the desperate resolve and decisive leadership that turned the tide of the entire campaign, rendered with deep historical reverence in a magnificent Mongolian historical costume painting. An evocative scene detailing the aftermath of the battle at sunset over the valley of Ain Jalut, showing the Mamluk army standing victorious amidst the scattered, broken formations and fallen warriors of the Mongol Empire, symbolizing the definitive end of the Mongol westward expansion and the salvation of the Islamic world, portrayed through the powerful and richly textured lens of a Mongolian historical costume painting. Illustrate the terrifying initial charge of the 50,000-strong Mongol cavalry descending upon the Mamluk vanguard, arrows darkening the sky from their legendary composite bows, emphasizing the sheer unstoppable force and historical invincibility that characterized the Mongol war machine just before they encountered the Mamluk trap, detailed with meticulous attention to armor and weaponry in a classic Mongolian historical costume painting.
Create a dramatic historical representation of the Mamluk court in Cairo, focusing on Sultan Kutuz's decisive confrontation with the arrogant Mongol messengers immediately prior to their execution, signifying the refusal to surrender and the commitment to fight, capturing the palpable tension and the cultural clash between the two empires, executed in the elaborate, historically informed style of a Mongolian historical costume painting. Visualizing the strategic layout of the battlefield at Ain Jalut, displaying an overhead or high-angle view, emphasizing the horseshoe formation of the Mamluk ambush, where the Mongols rode unknowingly into a perfect killing zone, focusing on the tactical brilliance and utilization of the terrain near Goliath Spring, a complex strategic map beautifully detailed as a narrative Mongolian historical costume painting. A close-up action shot focusing intensely on the brutal hand-to-hand clash of the two elite cavalry forces, the Mamluk Hulams and the Mongol Tumans,
highlighting the specialized weapons like the Mamluk curved scimitars and the powerful Mongol composite bows, depicting the desperate, bloody fighting that lasted all day under the September sun, stylized as a dynamic and visceral Mongolian historical costume painting. A symbolic depiction capturing the shattered morale and subsequent flight of the remaining Mongol warriors after Kitbuka's fall, showcasing the exact moment the myth of their historical invincibility was irrevocably broken in the fields of Palestine, rendered with the harsh realism of defeat, contrasting starkly with the organized chaos of the relentless Mamluk pursuit, realized in the detailed method of a Mongolian historical costume painting. Portray Baibars on horseback surveying the victorious battlefield of Ain Jalut, his expression a complex mixture of triumph and underlying ambition, hinting at the political treachery that would follow only 2 months later with the assassination of Kutuz, serving as a historical footnote to the great military victory, depicted in the heroic yet subtly ominous manner of a traditional Mongolian historical costume painting. A dual-panel composition contrasting the overwhelming destructive force and terror of the Mongol siege of Baghdad, 1258, with the determined final defensive stand of the Mamluks at Ain Jalut, 1260, visually establishing the profound stakes of the battle, the survival versus the destruction of civilization, captured in 2 connected, dramatic murals within the overall style framework of a Mongolian historical costume painting. Portray Baibars on horseback surveying the victorious battlefield of Ain Jalut, his expression a complex mixture of triumph and underlying ambition, hinting at the political treachery that would follow only 2 months later with the assassination of Kutuz, serving as a historical footnote to the great military victory, depicted in the heroic yet subtly ominous manner of a traditional Mongolian historical costume painting. A dual-panel composition contrasting the overwhelming destructive force and terror of the Mongol siege of Baghdad, 1258, with the determined final defensive stand of the Mamluks at Ain Jalut, 1260, visually establishing the profound stakes of the battle, the survival versus the destruction of civilization, captured in 2 connected, dramatic murals within the overall style framework of a Mongolian historical costume painting.
Depict Sultan Kutuz in his armor, standing resolutely amidst his assembled Mamluk generals in Cairo, giving the stern order for the execution of the arrogant Mongol envoys. Focus on the contrast between the horrified expressions of the Mongol emissaries and the cold, unwavering determination of Kutuz, set against the backdrop of fortified city walls, captured in a dramatic, narrative-focused Mongolian historical costume painting. A sweeping cinematic view of the initial Mongol charge at Ain Jalut, featuring thousands of swift cavalry archers, led by General Kitbuka, thundering across the open Jezreel Valley, their composite bows drawn taut and a massive cloud of arrows darkening the sky, showcasing the terrifying, seemingly unstoppable momentum of the horde, illustrated with intense motion and historical accuracy as a detailed Mongolian historical costume painting. Detailed visualization of the moment Mamluk forces, led by Baibars, execute the feigned retreat, luring the charging, overconfident Mongol heavy cavalry deeper into the hidden horseshoe trap at Ain Jalut Mali, emphasizing the dust and chaos of the maneuver under the bright 1060 Palestine sun, rendered in the meticulous detail and vibrant color palette characteristic of a masterfully executed, dramatic Mongolian historical costume painting. Focus tightly on the pivotal instant Kutuz, having hidden his main force, dramatically removes his helmet and cries, "Islam!" before leading the surprise countercharge down the surrounding hills into the flanks of the trapped Mongol army, highlighting his fierce resolve and the shock on the faces of the encircled Mongol warriors in the valley,
meticulously detailed in the style of a powerful, dynamic Mongolian historical costume painting. A high-angle topographical rendering of the Ain Jalut Valley, illustrating the strategic deployment. Baibars light skirmishers drawing the Mongols forward, while the main Mamluk host remains perfectly concealed within the surrounding hills, emphasizing the geographical layout used to facilitate the decisive ambush, executed with the cartographic precision suitable for a detailed military-themed Mongolian historical costume painting. A tragic yet historically significant scene capturing the final moments of General Kitbuka, the Nestorian Christian Mongol commander, surrounded by relentless Mamluk warriors after his army's collapse in the valley, depicting his desperate attempt to rally his remaining troops before being overwhelmed and slain, rendered in deep, somber tones suitable for a monumental Mongolian historical costume painting.
A wide, haunting vista of the Ain Jalut battlefield at sunset after the Mamluk victory, showing exhausted Mamluk soldiers surveying the valley strewn with the fallen bodies and shattered equipment of the previously invincible Mongol army. The golden hour light casting long shadows, symbolizing the end of the myth of Mongol invincibility. Stylized as a powerful and reflective Mongolian historical costume painting. Visualize the moment the Mongol western expansion halts abruptly, two massive armies locked in brutal, close-quarters combat within the narrow confines of the ambush zone, illustrating the sheer physical exertion and desperation of the fighting as the relentless Mongol war machine finally encounters a force that refuses to break, rendered dynamically in the expressive style of a fierce Mongolian historical costume painting. Illustrate the background context, a Mamluk soldier gazing west, haunted by visions of the distant destruction of Baghdad, libraries burning, the Tigris running black with ink, and the widespread terror inflicted by the Mongol forces, serving as a silent, powerful motivation for the fight at Ain Jalut, portrayed with stark emotional intensity in a highly detailed, historically informed Mongolian historical costume painting. Depict the strict, specialized training of Mamluk slave soldiers during their youth in Egypt, focusing on their proficiency with the bow and horsemanship, contrasting their rigorous discipline with the wild nature of the Mongol steppes, emphasizing the professional, highly organized military culture that faced the horde, presented as an instructional, ceremonial Mongolian historical costume painting. A secret, tense nighttime meeting 2 months after the victory, showing Baibars and his co-conspirators planning the assassination of Sultan Qutuz during the hunting trip, focusing on the dark shadows and conspiratorial whispers that contrast sharply with the recent battlefield glory, capturing the ruthless political maneuvering in a dramatic, focused Mongolian historical costume painting. Depict Hulagu Khan receiving the devastating news of Kitbuka's defeat and the loss of the western flank while dealing with the succession crisis back east, illustrating his furious reaction, symbolizing the shattering of the myth of his family's military perfection, shown in a grand throne room setting with worried subordinates, composed as a highly narrative Mongolian historical costume painting. Depict Sultan Qutuz, helmet cast aside, shouting Islam as he charges from the hidden hills surrounding Ain Jalut, leading the Mamluk flanking maneuver against the unsuspecting Mongol cavalry caught in the horseshoe trap, dust rising intensely under the September sun, capturing the precise moment the trap sprung and the momentum shifted in 1260, rendered in dramatic lighting and vibrant historical detail. Mongolian historical costume painting.
A close-up, intense portrait of the Mongol general Kitbuka, a Nestorian Christian, moments before his demise at Ain Jalut. Confusion and fierce determination etched on his battle-worn face, surrounded by overwhelming Mamluk lancers, arrows filling the air, signifying the final, brutal collapse of the myth of Mongol invincibility in the fateful year 1260.
emphasizing the chaos of the unexpected defeat. Mongolian historical costume painting. The cunning tactical maneuver of Baybar's advance guard initiating the battle. Mamluk heavy cavalry pretending to rout and flee into the valley, drawing the overconfident Mongol pursuit deep into the designated killing zone, illustrating the strategic deception pivotal to the victory, featuring the speed of the horses and the desperate appearance of the staged flight against the backdrop of the dry hills of northern Palestine. Mongolian historical costume painting. A panoramic vista of the Ain Jalut Valley in 1260, overwhelmed by the clash of 20,000 Mamluk warriors and the 50,000-strong Mongol contingent, highlighting the geographical choke point and the sheer density of the fighting, symbolizing the historical fulcrum where the Mongol westward expansion was decisively and permanently halted, altering the course of global civilization. Mongolian historical costume painting. Vivid depiction of Mamluk warriors, former slave soldiers trained since childhood, fighting with ferocious, desperate intensity, knowing that the fall of Egypt meant the annihilation of their culture. Their resolve contrasting sharply with the previously arrogance of the Mongol cavalry, showing disciplined Mamluk lines holding against the chaotic rush of the invaders. Mongolian historical costume painting. An illustration focusing on the highly effective Mongol composite bows and swift cavalry, momentarily stalled and in disarray, showing archers attempting to reform lines while being overrun by Mamluk lancers, emphasizing the visual shock and confusion of the Mongols realizing their superior tactical method was anticipated and countered by Kutuzov's trap. Mongolian historical costume painting. A solemn, late afternoon scene immediately following the battle, the setting sun casting long shadows over the field of Ain Jalut, littered with the bodies of fallen Mongol warriors and shattered weaponry, Mamluk standards planted triumphantly, representing the end of the legend of Mongol invincibility and the dawning of a new era of Mamluk dominance in the Near East. Mongolian historical costume painting. A highly stylized dual-panel representation, one side showing the chaotic retreat of the surviving Mongol remnants from Ain Jalut, the other showing Hulagu Khan in Persia receiving the devastating news of the first major field defeat, his expression a mixture of disbelief and consuming fury, emphasizing the seismic political shockwave across the empire. Mongolian historical costume painting.
Depict the visual contrast between the heavily armored, disciplined Mamluk horsemen of Egyptian origin and the lighter, highly mobile, fur-clad Mongol riders from the steppes, engaged in fierce, close-quarters combat within the narrowest point of the valley, capturing the raw energy of the collision that decided the fate of the Levant in 1260. Mongolian historical costume painting. A historically dramatic scene showing the triumphant return journey after Ain Jalut, interrupted by the treachery of Baybars and other generals assassinating Sultan Kutuz during a hunting trip, illustrating the ruthless political aftermath of the victory, emphasizing the transition of power immediately following the world-changing military success in the valley. Mongolian historical costume painting. An allegorical depiction of the Mamluk cavalry shielding the ancient libraries and cultural centers of Cairo from the encroaching shadow of the Mongol invasion, symbolized by the battle scene at Ain Jalut, where determination saved Islamic civilization from the fate suffered by Baghdad just 2 years prior, stressing the high stakes of the 1260 confrontation. The moment the Mamluk forces fully encircled the Mongol army, the sun blazing overhead, highlighting the desperate, focused effort of the Mamluks to break the Mongol ranks that had previously never bent.
focusing specifically on the intense hand-to-hand fighting, where cavalry swords and maces determined the survival of continents in northern Palestine. The moment Sultan Qutuz throws off his helmet and charges, commanding the hidden Mamluk main force to burst forth from the surrounding olive groves and hillsides, encircling the pursuing Mongol cavalry in the dusty valley of Ain Jalut, symbolizing the turning tide of global history, rendered in the intense and detailed technique of a Mongolian historical costume painting. General Kitbuka, the Nestorian Christian Mongol commander, fighting desperately at the center of the collapsing Hulegu contingent, surrounded by fierce Mamluk horsemen armed with scimitars and lances, his face grim with the realization of the fatal ambush, capturing the end of the Mongol invincibility myth, executed in the rich, traditional colors characteristic of a dramatic Mongolian historical costume painting. Depict the brilliant tactical maneuver of Baibars, leading the Mamluk vanguard in a carefully staged, chaotic feigned retreat across the sun-baked plains of Ain Jalut, drawing the overconfident Mongol heavy cavalry deep into the prepared kill zone, featuring extreme dust and motion blur, visualized as a pivotal scene within a complex narrative cycle characteristic of a Mongolian historical costume painting. General Kitbuka, the Nestorian Christian Mongol commander, fighting desperately at the center of the collapsing Hulegu contingent, surrounded by fierce Mamluk horsemen armed with scimitars and lances, his face grim with the realization of the fatal ambush, capturing the end of the Mongol invincibility myth, executed in the rich, traditional colors characteristic of a dramatic Mongolian historical costume painting. Depict the brilliant tactical maneuver of Baibars, leading the Mamluk vanguard in a carefully staged, chaotic feigned retreat across the sun-baked plains of Ain Jalut, drawing the overconfident Mongol heavy cavalry deep into the prepared kill zone, featuring extreme dust and motion blur, visualized as a pivotal scene within a complex narrative cycle characteristic of a Mongolian historical costume painting.
A close-up view of the brutal clash between the Mamluk elite Hilman cavalry and the swift Mongol horse archers, emphasizing the lethal power of the Mongol composite bows against the armored Mamluk horsemen, highlighting broken arrows and shattered shields under the severe light of the midday sun, all depicted with the vibrant detail and historical accuracy required of a grand Mongolian historical costume painting. Sultan Qutuz standing defiantly before the walls of Cairo, ordering the heads of the executed Mongol envoys to be mounted on spikes, an act of supreme courage and rejection of surrender that preceded the march to Ain Jalut, emphasizing the heavy chainmail and ceremonial attire of the Mamluk court, meticulously rendered in the dramatic, historically significant style of a Mongolian historical costume painting. A panoramic depiction of the Ain Jalut battlefield just as the two armies first collide, showing the 50,000 Mongol warriors charging across the valley floor towards the 20,000 Mamluks, representing the collision between the world's largest empire and the last line of defense for the Islamic world in 1260, captured with the sweeping scope of a monumental Mongolian historical costume painting. The solemn aftermath of the Battle of Ain Jalut at sunset, showing the exhausted but victorious Mamluk soldiers inspecting the captured Mongol standards and surveying the thousands of fallen enemy horsemen, emphasizing the silence and dust settling over the valley, marking the definitive end of the Mongol westward expansion, styled precisely as a victorious segment in a comprehensive Mongolian historical costume painting. Illustrate the conceptual breaking of the myth of Mongol invincibility,
a towering image of a massive, cracked Mongol banner being trampled beneath the hooves of a charging Mamluk horse, symbolizing the shattered confidence after the decisive defeat at Ain Jalut, utilizing dynamic motion and shadow play to convey high drama, presented in the richly layered textures and symbolic language inherent in a Mongolian historical costume painting. Baibars, the brilliant but ruthless general, watching the final rout of the Mongols from a ridge, his face alight with fierce ambition not just for victory but for the Sultanate itself, foreshadowing his assassination of Kutos shortly after the battle. An intensely focused portrait study of the future Mamluk ruler, detailed meticulously in the tradition of a powerful Mongolian historical costume painting. The relentless countercharge of the fresh Mamluk reserves, screaming Islam as ordered by Kutos, slamming into the flanks of the surprised and overextended Mongol pursuing force, depicting the chaos and confusion of the Mongols realizing they have been trapped, featuring banners and intense battle detail, rendered with the traditional precision and storytelling vigor of a compelling Mongolian historical costume painting.
A dramatic juxtaposition showing the Tigris River, black with the ink of destroyed books from Baghdad, flowing next to a depiction of the Mamluks fighting fiercely at Ain Jalut, illustrating how this singular victory saved the core of Islamic civilization from total annihilation and prevented potential Mongol conquest of North Africa, conceptualized within the framework of a sequential epic Mongolian historical costume painting. A high-action scene of Kitbuka, distinguished by his armor and command insignia, making a desperate final stand with his personal guard, realizing too late that Hulagu's departure sealed his fate, struggling against overwhelming Mamluk numbers in the heart of the valley, capturing the tragic final moments of the invasion force, utilizing the historical accuracy required for an exceptional Mongolian historical costume painting. Detail the climactic moment of the Mamluk ambush at Ain Jalut, showing Kutus discarding his helmet and charging from the hills, shattering the extended Mongol formation, rendered in vivid detail, emphasizing the unexpected entrapment and fierce Mamluk counterattack against the renowned horse archers, highlighting the chaos and dust of the decisive battle, meticulously captured in the dramatic aesthetic of a Mongolian historical costume painting. General Kitbuka, the Nestorian Mongol commander, stands defiant in the center of the Ain Jalut Valley, realizing the disastrous nature of the Mamluk trap. Surrounded by his retreating and broken cavalry units, his face etched with disbelief and fury as Mamluk forces close in from three sides, symbolizing the end of the myth of Mongol invincibility, depicted with powerful emotion in a Mongolian historical costume painting. A dynamic scene capturing Baibars leading the feigned Mamluk retreat, his heavily armored contingent drawing the relentless Mongol vanguard deep into the valley, arrows flying in dense clouds against the backdrop of the Jezreel Valley hills, illustrating the tactical genius and calculated risk that defined the turning point of the campaign, executed with the texture and color palette characteristic of a Mongolian historical costume painting. Sultan Kutus, depicted in his royal Mamluk armor, delivers the defiant decree for the execution of Hulagu Khan's arrogant Mongol envoys in Cairo, symbolizing the refusal to capitulate and the high stakes involved in defending the last great Islamic power against the overwhelming terror of the Western Mongol armies, emphasizing the tension and historical gravity of the moment, visualized as a commanding piece of a Mongolian historical costume painting. A dynamic scene capturing Baibars leading the feigned Mamluk retreat, his heavily armored contingent drawing the relentless Mongol vanguard deep into the valley, arrows flying in dense clouds against the backdrop of the Jezreel Valley hills, illustrating the tactical genius and calculated risk that defined the turn point of the campaign, executed with the texture and color palette characteristic of a Mongolian historical costume painting.
Sultan Qutuz, depicted in his royal Mamluk armor, delivers the defiant decree for the execution of Hulagu Khan's arrogant Mongol envoys in Cairo, symbolizing the refusal to capitulate and the high stakes involved in defending the last great Islamic power against the overwhelming terror of the Western Mongol armies, emphasizing the tension and historical gravity of the moment, visualized as a commanding piece of a Mongolian historical costume painting.
Illustrate the sheer terror preceding the battle. The mighty Mongol army, 50,000 strong, sweeping through the Syrian plains, their fast cavalry units and composite bows showcased as the instruments of conquest that had recently destroyed Baghdad, conveying the sense of unstoppable historical momentum just before their fateful confrontation with the Mamluks, presented as a monumental Mongolian historical costume painting. The immediate aftermath of the battle at sunset over Ain Jalut, showing the devastated field littered with fallen Mongol warriors and horses, the victorious yet exhausted Mamluk cavalry standing amidst the debris of war, the symbolism of the halted Western expansion clearly visible in the weary triumph of the Mamluk standards, rendered in a subdued, commemorative style of a Mongolian historical costume painting. Focus on the technology and brutality. A Mamluk warrior using a heavy saber to clash directly against a Mongol horse archer firing his composite bow at close range, demonstrating the fierce hand-to-hand combat that defined the decisive phase of the fighting within the constrained valley, emphasizing the detailed armor differences and the desperation of the final stand, captured vividly in a Mongolian historical costume painting. Hulagu Khan, far away in Persia, receiving the devastating news of the complete defeat and the death of Kitbuka at Ain Jalut, depicted in his imperial tent, the expression of shock and profound rage illuminating his face as the reality of the first major field loss sinks in, realizing the irreparable damage to the myth of Mongol invincibility, portrayed dramatically within the framework of a Mongolian historical costume painting. A composite image representing the world historical impact, one side showing the destruction of Baghdad, Tigris running black with ink, contrasted sharply with the other side showing the Mamluk victory at Ain Jalut, signifying the preservation of Islamic civilization and the deflection of the Mongol tide, capturing this pivotal divergence point in a grand epic diptych format as a complex Mongolian historical costume painting. Depict the final rout, where the Mamluks relentlessly pursue the fleeing, broken remnants of the Mongol army across the plains of northern Palestine for miles, ensuring the total annihilation of the remaining forces and securing the immediate strategic advantage, emphasizing the Mamluk discipline and the complete breakdown of the once impregnable Mongol command structure, executed in the dynamic brushstrokes of a Mongolian historical costume painting. A composite image representing the world historical impact, one side showing the destruction of Baghdad, Tigris running black with ink, contrasted sharply with the other side showing the Mamluk victory at Ain Jalut, signifying the preservation of Islamic civilization and the deflection of the Mongol tide, capturing this pivotal divergence point in a grand epic diptych format as a complex Mongolian historical costume painting. Depict the final rout, where the Mamluks relentlessly pursue the fleeing, broken remnants of the Mongol army across the plains of northern Palestine for miles, ensuring the total annihilation of the remaining forces and securing the immediate strategic advantage, emphasizing the Mamluk discipline and the complete breakdown of the once impregnable Mongol command structure, executed in the dynamic brushstrokes of a Mongolian historical costume painting. A detailed focus on the Mamluk slave soldiers during their elite training in Egypt, showcasing their mastery of horsemanship, strategy, and diverse weapon systems,
contrasting their disciplined background with the tribal ferocity of Mongols, representing them as the highly trained military class prepared to face the impossible odds at Ain Jalut, presented with cultural fidelity as a Mongolian historical costume painting. An atmospheric depiction of the Ain Jalut Valley, Goliath Spring, just before the battle begins, shrouded in the early morning mist, illustrating the hidden Mamluk forces waiting patiently in the surrounding hills, contrasted with the approaching, arrogant Mongol column, oblivious to the trap laid before them in this ancient and fateful location, capturing the tension in a sublime Mongolian historical costume painting. A dramatic close-up of Sultan Qutuz in Cairo, standing resolute before the impaled heads of the Mongol envoys, his face grim with determination. The scene emphasizes the immense political risk and personal courage required to defy the largest empire the world had ever known, illustrating the moment he committed to the fight that saved a civilization, rendered in the hyper-detailed artistic style of a Mongolian historical costume painting. Visualize the dusty, chaotic maneuver of Baibar's vanguard executing the deceptive feigned retreat at Ain Jalut. Show the Mamluk heavy cavalry skillfully turning their horses while firing reverse shots, drawing the aggressively pursuing, overconfident Mongol horsemen deeper into the narrow valley where the decisive ambush awaited, captured with intense detail, embodying the spirit of a Mongolian historical costume painting. Depict the critical moment within the valley of Ain Jalut, where General Kitbuka, astride a powerful warhorse, suddenly realizes that his army has ridden directly into a meticulously planned Mamluk horseshoe trap. Capture the shock and confusion as fresh Mamluk forces erupt from the surrounding hillsides, enveloping the fragmented Mongol pursuing units, presented in the vivid, narrative style of a Mongolian historical costume painting. Sultan Qutuz, having cast aside his helmet to be easily seen, leading the Mamluk reserve charge out of the concealed ravines, he screams the war cry, "Islam!" as thousands of elite Mamluk warriors burst forth, hitting the flank of the surprised Mongol forces, illustrating the tactical genius of utilizing terrain and the unwavering religious fervor of the defenders in the majestic style of a Mongolian historical costume painting.
A tragic portrait of General Kitbukha, the Nestorian Mongol commander, surrounded by Mamluk soldiers, wielding a broken sword and fighting fiercely until the last breath in the dust-choked valley, highlight his distinctive armor and the desperation of the Mongol defeat, representing the end of the Western Mongol advance and the death of their legendary invincibility, executed precisely as a Mongolian historical costume painting. A wide, melancholic view of the Ain Jalut battlefield at sunset following the Mamluk victory. The valley floor is littered with the bodies of fallen Mongol warriors and horses, signifying the massive human cost and the monumental shift in global power dynamics achieved that day, rendering the scene with profound historical weight in the detailed methodology of a Mongolian historical costume painting. Illustrate the moment Hulegu Khan, far away in Persia or en route to the Kurultai, receives the devastating news of Kitbukha's complete defeat and the destruction of his remaining army in Syria. Capture the visceral rage and disbelief of the great Khan's brother upon hearing that the unstoppable force was finally stopped, detailed in the expressive and dramatic format of a Mongolian historical costume painting. Highly detailed side-by-side comparison of Mamluk heavy horse armor, Kipchak-style, layered mail and lamellar, and the lighter, fast, protective leather and silk armor utilized by the typical Mongol archer cavalryman. This comparison should emphasize the contrasting military philosophies that met at Ain Jalut, presented with exacting precision in the style of a Mongolian historical costume painting. A shattered, ornate Mongol standard, perhaps featuring a stylized falcon or dragon lying broken in the bloody soil of the Jezreel Valley, overshadowed by the triumphant figure of a Mamluk horseman. This symbolizes the irreversible shattering of the myth of Mongol invincibility that was propagated across continents prior to September 1260,
depicted beautifully as a Mongolian historical costume painting. The Mamluk army, 20,000 strong, riding forth from the towering walls and gates of Fusat, Cairo, in July 1260, the last bastion of organized resistance against the horde. Their faces show grim resolve, aware that the fate of the entire Islamic world rests upon their single, desperate venture into Palestine, meticulously chronicled in the traditional narrative style of a Mongolian historical costume painting. A conceptual image contrasting the burning ruins of Baghdad in 1258, Tigris water blackened with ink from destroyed libraries, with the resolute Mamluk preparations in Cairo for the battle 2 years later. The scene links the brutal antecedent, Baghdad's fall, directly to the heroic defense required at Ain Jalut, executed in a split-scene diptych format of a Mongolian historical costume painting.
A dark, dramatic scene depicting the assassination of Sultan Qutuz by Baybars and his co-conspirators during a hunting trip shortly after the victory. Baybars stands over the fallen sultan, immediately seizing the crown, illustrating the tragic postscript of ambition and betrayal that followed the world-saving triumph, rendered with high contrast in the style of a Mongolian historical costume painting. A dramatic depiction of the Mamluk main force erupting from the hidden folds of the hills surrounding Ain Jalut Valley, executing the decisive ambush, focusing on the sudden panic spreading through the pursuing Mongol cavalry as they realize the deadly trap has sprung, rendered with intense chiaroscuro, dusty atmosphere, and intricate detail of both armies' heraldry. Mongolian historical costume painting. The doomed final stand of General Kitbukha, the Nestorian Christian Mongol commander, surrounded by relentless Mamluk horsemen in the dust-choked valley, capture the look of grim realization and final defiant resistance against overwhelming odds, emphasizing the richness of his non-Islamic armor and the desperation of his isolated 20,000 troops. Mongolian historical costume painting. A heroic portrait of Sultan Qutuz tearing off his helmet and shouting "Islam" as he leads the charge from the ridge into the trapped Mongol center, his armor gleaming under the harsh September sun, symbolizing the turning tide of history and the desperate courage required by the Mamluks to face the previously invincible world-conquering foe. Mongolian historical costume painting. A visual comparison highlighting the distinct military cultures clashing at Ain Jalut. On one side, the swift, light-armored Mongol horse archers wielding their powerful composite bows, and on the other, the heavily trained Mamluk gulams with their curved swords and layered protection, set against the rocky, sun-baked backdrop of the northern Palestinian hills. Mongolian historical costume painting. A detailed horizontal scroll depicting the chaotic moment of the feigned Mongol retreat led by Baybars, drawing the confident Mongol heavy cavalry deeper into the prepared kill zone, showing the deceptive tactical discipline required to execute this highly risky maneuver under heavy arrow fire from the believing Mongol pursuers. Mongolian historical costume painting. A somber landscape scene showing the aftermath of the battle at sunset over Ain Jalut, with thousands of fallen Mongol warriors and horses littering the ground, illustrating the magnitude of the Mongol Empire's first catastrophic defeat in open battle, marking the decisive and unexpected end of their relentless westward expansion. Mongolian historical costume painting.
The stark, defiant scene in Cairo, where Sultan Qutuz orders the execution Kohilegu Khan's Mongol envoys, their severed heads placed on pikes outside the city gates, a powerful symbolic act, refusing surrender and committing the Mamluks to inevitable war, knowing that this bold decision meant the survival or annihilation of their entire civilization. Mongolian historical costume painting. A powerful court scene depicting the moment Hülegu Khan, far away in Persia and focused on the succession crisis following the great Khan Munk's death, receives the shocking news of Kitbukha's annihilation at Ain Jalut,
illustrating his intense fury and the sudden, unexpected realization of the new, formidable boundary to his expanding empire. Mongolian historical costume painting. Focus on the pivotal moment the Mamluk reserve cavalry, positioned in the high ground, descends upon the flanks of the overextended Mongol pursuit force, capturing the kinetic energy and the dramatic shift from Mongol victory certainty to total encirclement and operational collapse within the narrow confines of Goliath's Spring Valley. Mongolian historical costume painting. A highly symbolic painting representing the shattering of the Mongol invincibility myth. Perhaps a great stone Mongol banner fractured in the foreground, with Mamluk flags rising victorious over the valley of Ain Jalut, emphasizing the monumental geopolitical consequences of this single day that saved the heart of the Islamic world. Mongolian historical costume painting. A dynamic pre-battle meeting between Kutuz and the ambitious General Baibars, discussing the high-stakes feigned retreat strategy. Capture Baibar's youthful aggression and determination for vengeance against the Mongols who drove him from Syria, highlighting the tension and shared desperation that cemented their temporary military alliance. Mongolian historical costume painting. An epic, detailed overhead tactical view of the entire Battle of Ain Jalut, showing the strategic deployment of the Mamluk horseshoe formation hidden expertly within the terrain contours, the central skirmish of the vanguard, and the Mongol pursuit collapsing inward upon itself into the deadly, prepared kill zone of the valley floor. Mongolian historical costume painting. A dramatic panoramic scene of the Battle of Ain Jalut, September 1260, capturing the moment the Mamluk forces erupt from the surrounding hills in a perfect horseshoe formation, ensnaring the pursuing, overconfident Mongol heavy cavalry in the valley below, illustrating the critical turning point where the myth of Mongol invincibility was shattered by superior Mamluk tactics and fierce determination. Mongolian historical costume painting.
Intensified depiction with a brutal clash between the Mamluk Ghilman elite cavalry and the Mongol riders, focusing on the chaos of the initial engagement led by Baibars, highlighting the intricate details of composite bows, curved scimitars, and layered armor, set against the dust-choked landscape of the Jezreel Valley during the intense heat of the September confrontation. Mongolian historical costume painting. Sultan Kutuz, depicted at the height of the Mamluk countercharge, helmet discarded to inspire his troops, roaring his battle cry as he leads the reserve forces into the encircled Mongol ranks, symbolizing the desperate resolve of the defenders of Islam against the seemingly endless tide of the Mongol advance across the Middle East. Mongolian historical costume painting. A poignant, action-filled portrait of General Kitbuka, the Nestorian Christian commander of the remaining Mongol forces, in his final, desperate stand at Ain Jalut, surrounded by Mamluk soldiers, his face conveying determination mixed with the realization of inevitable defeat, representing the dramatic halt of the westward Mongol expansion. Mongolian historical costume painting. The desolate scene following the battle, showing the Ain Jalut Valley under the pale light of sunset, filled with debris and the fallen bodies of Mongol warriors and horses, emphasizing the profound silence after the chaos, marking the absolute historical significance of the Mamluk victory and the survival of the Islamic world. Mongolian historical costume painting. A tense, dramatic depiction of the moment in Cairo where Sultan Kutuz commands the execution of Hulegu Khan's arrogant envoys, the background featuring the massive city gates, illustrating the profound refusal to surrender and the commitment to a fight to the death, signaling the Mamluk defiance against the empire that had destroyed Baghdad. Mongolian historical costume painting.
Dynamic visualization of Baybar's light cavalry executing the crucial feigned retreat, drawing the Mongol pursuit deep into the designated trap within the valley, conveying the speed and deception necessary for the successful tactical maneuver that set the stage for the decisive Mamluk victory. Mongolian historical costume painting. An evocative scene of Hulagu Khan hastily retreating with the majority of his massive army across the Persian landscape, leaving the smaller detachment under Kitbuka behind in the Levant due to the succession crisis following the great Khan Munka's death, highlighting the strategic opportunity gifted to the Mamluks. Mongolian historical costume painting.
A focused study contrasting the disciplined, Turkish-origin Mamluk slave soldiers, standing in perfect formation with their distinctive armor and banners, against the distant, chaotic energy of the advancing, seemingly limitless Mongol hordes, emphasizing the qualitative difference and the Mamluks' role as the final bulwark of civilization. Mongolian historical costume painting. A symbolic representation of the historical consequences of Ain Jalut, showing a map-like composition where the westward advance of the Mongol tide is visibly halted at the Levant, illustrating the prevention of the potential invasion of Egypt, North Africa, and ultimately Southern Europe. Mongolian historical costume painting. Extreme close-up on Sultan Kutuz's hand throwing off his ornate helmet just before the signal for the counterattack, revealing his determined face and the chaos reflected in his eyes, representing the moment of high personal risk and leadership that galvanized the Mamluk victory over the previously undefeated Mongol army. Mongolian historical costume painting. Detailed illustration focusing on the prowess of the Mongol horse archers during the initial engagement, depicting their swift movements, the power of their composite bows, and the terrifying volley of arrows darkening the Palestinian sky as they attempt to break the Mamluk lines before being drawn into the deadly trap. Mongolian historical costume painting. A panoramic view of the Battle of Ain Jalut, 1260, capturing the moment of the Mamluk counterattack where Sultan Kutuz leads the main hidden contingent emerging from the hills to encircle the pursuing Mongol heavy cavalry, emphasize the chaos and the desperate turning point of the conflict, illustrating the intricate armor of both Mamluk and Mongol warriors with meticulous detail, rendered in the dramatic, saturated colors of a Mongolian historical costume painting. A detailed composition depicting the moment Sultan Kutuz decisively rejects the Mongol demand for surrender in Cairo, 1260, show the defiant Sultan standing over the kneeling, arrogant Mongol envoys, their ornate diplomatic costumes sharply contrasted against the Mamluk elite guard, focusing on the expressions of impending doom and fierce resolve, captured in the precise, narrative style of a Mongolian historical costume painting. An epic, somber portrayal of the destruction of Baghdad in 1258, focusing on the sheer scale of the atrocity committed by Hulagu Khan's Tumans, illustrates streams of slaughtered civilians and countless precious scrolls floating in the ink-stained Tigris, serving as a powerful visual antecedent to the stakes at Ain Jalut, emphasizing the overwhelming terror and merciless efficiency of the Mongol war machine, realized in the stark, narrative structure of a Mongolian historical costume painting.
Focus for the brilliant tactical maneuver of the feigned retreat led by Baybars at Ain Jalut. Show the Mamluk vanguard turning and fleeing under a hail of arrows, deceiving the Mongol commander Kitbuka into a zealous, uncoordinated pursuit deeper into the valley, emphasizing the dynamic motion of the cavalry and the strategic geography of the Jezreel Valley, depicted with the vibrant energy and historical precision of a Mongolian historical costume painting. The dramatic, chaotic final stand of Kitbuka Noyan at Ain Jalut,
show the Mongol general, distinguished by his Nestorian cross and heavy armor, desperately fighting against a tide of Mamluk warriors after his forces are broken, symbolizing the moment the Mongol myth of invincibility shattered, capturing the close-quarters combat and the dust-filled atmosphere, meticulously detailed in the historical documentation style of a Mongolian historical costume painting. A solemn scene depicting Sultan Kutuz walking the fields of Ain Jalut at dusk after the victory, with the vanquished Mongol forces scattered across the valley floor, symbolizing the definitive end of the Mongol western advance and the saving of the Islamic heartland, emphasizing the historical wake of the moment and the preservation of culture, executed with the grand scale and detailed military dress of a Mongolian historical costume painting. An evocative image showcasing the rigorous training of young Mamluk soldiers in Cairo before the 1260 campaign, focusing on their elite status as highly skilled cavalrymen proficient with the composite bow and scimitar, emphasize the disciplined formation and the intensity of their military education, highlighting the unique Turkic and Circassian origins of the fighters, captured in the ceremonial precision of a Mongolian historical costume painting. A visceral depiction of the initial cavalry clash at Ain Jalut, showing the sheer force of the Mongol charge meeting the defensive line of Baybar's Mamluk vanguard, illustrate the air thick with arrows from the powerful Mongol composite bows and the desperate melee of lances and swords, focusing intensely on the facial expressions of the combatants and the collision of the two powerful military cultures, rendered in the high-action detail